Miss Janet, will you put your number in front of your name just so it bumps you up the participant list? Pretty please.
If I can figure out how to do that quickly, I will do that.
Okay, you're going to see 3 little dots in your little square, upper right-hand corner.
I see it.
When you click on it, it's going to give you an option to rename.
Rename.
Got it?
Got it.
Oh, Janet. Let me just make sure everybody else is on here. Scott, can you give me a yes or something?
Yeah, here's a yes or something.
Okay, something works too. Okay, Mark, you can say whatever you want because Scott just started off being a smart aleck.
I'm here.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Janet, we heard from you. Jenny, I can see you. Can we hear you? Okay, thanks, committee members. And then Norlie and Patty, you guys are good? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Norlie. I can see you, Norlie. I just want to make sure you're okay for us to get ready to start.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you, Norlie. We just cannot go without you. So, okay, committee members, welcome to another great afternoon of standards and assessment. As you can see on the screen, we've got our dear Justice Ginsburg, and maybe if some of you watched the NewsHour a couple weeks ago, they had a poet on there, and of course, that's why I watch the NewsHours for the poetry. But the poet's name is Rosemary Traumer, and she's somebody that I kind of admire because she writes a poem every day, and she's been doing that for 15 years. And so maybe I'll start doing that tomorrow, but I've lost a lot of years in the process. But when she got home and found out that Justice Ginsburg had died, she knew she wanted to write the poem about Justice Ginsburg, and she was feeling very sad and very heavy and was looking through her words to kind of get some inspiration. And she was thinking about how Justice Ginsburg talked a lot about how societal change is incremental. And she took the quote that said, this is from Justice Ginsburg that says, "Real change, enduring change happens one step at a time." And from there, she wrote a poem that I feel like it kind of relates to what we do as a board. And it's called In the Steps of Rbg. So let me take one step right now, one step toward respect, and give me strength to take another toward clarity. And though my feet might feel like stones, let me take another step towards justice, and another toward equity, and another toward truth. And though my legs may feel leaden and slow, though someone else may step on my toes, may I inch forward toward forgiveness. May every step be toward a bridge. Enough divisiveness. And as I go, may I find joy in the stepping, grace in the edging toward great change. But if there's little joy, let me step anyway, then take another step and another and another. So board members, I know sometimes it feels like the work that we do is so incremental, but I just have to remember that every step, every action, every vote, even every opposing vote we do is a step towards a big decision and a step towards real change. So with that, I think it fits perfectly to head into our first action item, which is access recommendations supporting underrepresented, historically marginalized, and underserved students. And just as kind of like framing this discussion and action, I think it's important to remember that our job as a committee is to accept these recommendations. Our job is not to implement these recommendations, but to me, this is one of those steps. And I'm really hoping that as a committee, we can embrace these 5 recommendations. Number 1 being denounce racism, 2, provide professional learning on equity, literacy, and learning opportunities to help conquer the digital divide, to provide support for digital navigation for families, and to provide curricula that really supports inclusivity and marginalized groups. And I'm hoping that we can embrace these 5 recommendations from the Access Committee. But before we head into a discussion and before we head into asking questions, I want Dr. Patty Norman to give us some background and context, specifically on the definitions, the Equity Steering Committee, and what theoretical framework surrounds this work. So, Patty, will you start us off?
Well, thank you, Chair Gravett. I first wanted to thank Rosanna Benali, Sag, and also Brian Yazzie for being on the call and for being here today. So a huge shout out to you and the work that you're doing on our committee, helping our underrepresented students and finding a voice for all. And we wanted to thank you for these well thought out and very articulated recommendations for the committee to consider today. The Access Committee gave us the opportunity to meet with them and review the committee recommendations. And so Superintendent Dixon, myself, Chair Gravitt, and also Board Member Earl got to join in the committee and listen as the recommendations were reviewed. And as they were reviewed, we talked about the actions that are currently going on, the future actions that need to occur, and also about what our board is doing and the internal work of the staff at this time. And the one thing that we wanted to put forward so that all board members are aware is that at this time, the Utah State Board of Education is not choosing a theoretical framework. We're not looking at something that's already published and out there for us to grab onto and saying, this is the work we're doing. We're creating it from scratch. We're looking at the data of our students, our teachers, and our community. We're looking at the definitions that impact our students. And these are the types of things that need a lot of conversation, a lot of stakeholder input, because the work is huge and it is timely. So we did meet and review the recommendations and moving forward with them. An example of this could be something that one of the words is racist. And as a committee, there's so many theoretical frameworks that we could choose. And instead, we're choosing the one that's talking from a lens that Ibram Kendi, who is the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. And the type of work when we talk about racist is that it's an act, or it's a behavior. It's not a person. It's not a label you put on something, on someone. Instead, it's a label you put on something. And that thing can be changed. That action can be changed. It's a behavior. And that's similar to what happens in education. When we talk about students, we look at students and we say, these are actions that we can help change and we can help modify and in moving forward. So it really is about moving forward in love and kindness, as our Teacher of the Year, John Arthur, spoke to yesterday, who's also a member of our Access Committee, and we're so excited to have him on it, is he talked about the love and the healing that needs to happen, and not opening up fresh wounds or moving in that direction, but instead moving forward together in love and kindness to really look at what it means for the Utah State Board of Education. So appreciate Access letting all of us come and be a part of that meeting. And there are future meetings going forward that are going to be addressing these recommendations as well. So Chair, I turn it back over to you if there's any questions. I think you're still muted, Chair.
Well, you all were supposed to read my lips. I said, thank you, Patty. And also I wanted to thank Brian Yazzie and Rosanna Benali Sag for being with us today. But Holly Bell, do you want to say anything before we as a committee discuss this and hopefully take action?
Holly Bell, Equity Specialist for the Utah State Board of Education. And my role with the Access Committee, so your advisory committee on equity of educational services for students, is the staff representative. So I am able to participate in the meetings and have been present for the conversations. And my role was to present this memo to you for you to accept the recommendations. You gave an overview of, I was going to read the recommendations, but you gave the overview and you have that in front of you. So if you don't want me to read through those, then I will send the time back to you. But thank you so much for sharing your respects for our dear Justice Ginsburg. I have been in mourning, but I've also been celebrating that she was with us as long as she was and for her courage and strength. So thank you so much. I have to give you a personal thanks for that. So.
Thank you. Committee members, would you like Holly to go over those, or do you have questions for Holly or Patty or any of our Access chairs? Committee members, I open it up to you for questions. Board Member Cannon, go ahead.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. I guess all that's gone on recently with the racism that we have seen and encountered has just made me think that we should absolutely do away with the whole idea of race. I think race is something somebody came up with to try to put people in groups to be discriminated against. And I noticed that this year when we did the 2020 census, there was not a question about race, but you were asked to put in your ethnicity. And so when I see applications to fill out or whatever, and they ask me my race, I just choose not to respond or whatever, because I just think that that can be used to discriminate against people. So number one on these recommendations is dear to my heart, and I feel supportive of all of them. And that's just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Cannon. Board Member Earl.
Hi, yes, I just have a comment. So are you saying that we're building our theoretical framework, our framework around Ibram Kendi's writings? Is that accurate? No. What did you say that I just want to make sure I'm clear?
So Patty, will you clarify that? I believe the framework is, we're not building it around a specific framework. It comes from USBE, but Patty, will you clarify on that?
Correct. Thank you. And I appreciate the question. So we're building our framework from scratch. So just really talking about, and the framework that we're building is actually our strategic plan. So we're looking at the outcomes, and the measurable outcomes are those that have already been identified within our strategic plan, and looking at the indicators for all student groups and making sure we're closing the opportunity gaps for our students. That is our intended outcome. The purpose of the vocabulary is so that we have a starting point for discussion. One of the things that we really have noticed that is when we have conversations about race, or even about equity, there's a hesitation on the part of many people, and the hesitation is due to them not wanting to offend. And so they disengage from the conversation so that everyone can be a part of the conversation and that no assumptions are made with a word. For example, each word, and the reason why I said the word racist and I mentioned Ibram Kendi is I wanted to just talk about a definition, but we're not using that as a theoretical framework. But what I was talking about is a definition. If we as Utah State Board of Education create a definition, then there's no assumptions surrounding it. There's no assumptions of what theory, epistemology, or even theology that we're using, because we're creating a definition together. And once that definition is agreed upon, there's no assumptions about what it means, because the definition should be able to speak for itself and outside of any theoretical framework.
Thank you.
Okay, so of course, we've got to stay within Utah law, right? So I would encourage us, there's great things built into Utah law already that we could also work from. So I'd encourage you to go that way so that we don't to some of the critical race theory that's going on around the nation that's creating more of a divide. So thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Earl. Do we have any other questions from committee members?
Chair Gravitt, I was wondering if Brian, Yazzie, and Rosanna would like to just do a brief comment to address this for all of the work that they've done.
Yeah, I would love that. Brian or Rosanna, would you be willing to talk to us?
Sure. This is Rosanna Benali-Sag, the co-chair for the Access Committee. And I just want to thank you for allowing the time to actually address this. It is an important issue that we have been discussing since January, and with the pandemic and then also the rise in racial profiling and xenophobia, we had been talking about it before, but now that with the pandemic, it did exacerbate a lot of the racial profiling and xenophobia. And so I really appreciate board members and from this committee as well in addressing this, because our students they are having a hard time. And I think when we have these inequities, especially within race and ethnicity, it interferes with their academia and educational success. And so we want to be mindful, we want to be proactive rather than reactive. And so I commend the board for making the time to actually address this. And thank you, Holly and Patty, for coming to our meetings to be able to address this as well too. And so I hope we can all work together in unison, in unity, for the sake of our students, our families within the state.
Thank you so much. Brian?
And I too grateful for the opportunity to be able to be here and understanding the importance of this this subject. You know, it is a subject matter that I think sometimes people tend to get really nervous about. I'm the diversity and equity coordinator here in the Provo City School District. And so when I started my position 4 years ago, I was kind of given the responsibility to create a starting point as a district. You know, where can we head to be a more inclusive district? And so it's, as I've been trying to look at a framework, and I talked with, met a lot of people here in Provo from all different groups, all different perspectives. One thing I found is that everybody does have a common interest, and it's now trying to find what can we do to come together as a district, as a community. And I appreciate the words that were said today, because this is the beginning of what we're doing here with USBE is developing the framework for the future. And it's important work. It's I think it's right up there with everything that we talk about when it comes to academics and social emotional needs. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, it's right up there. And we all want to see success for our students. But now it's bringing all of our various perspectives together and having that open dialogue and discussion. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to create here in Provo. So I want to share with you real quickly, a personal story that I think will kind of give you maybe a little bit better understanding when it comes to racism. So I just turned 54 years old on Tuesday, and my first experience in my memory of racism happened when I was 4 years old. And I was living in Provo, Utah, while my parents were finishing up school at Brigham Young University. And it was a summer morning. I was playing with my friends outside. We were playing ball, and the ball got kicked into a neighbor's yard. And I was the closest one, so I, opened the gate and went in to get the ball, and I heard this man yelling from inside his house, and he came running out real quickly and was yelling at me to get off his lawn. And then he said, "I want you to get off my lawn, you dirty Indian." Oh. Now, I remember everything at that very moment. I remember his face. I remember what he looks like. And I'm 4 years old. And so that moment of trauma, 50 years later, is still embedded in my mind and in my memory. And so those are things that I hope as we build this plan that we can look at things that our students, future students here in Utah, don't ever have to experience, especially when they come into our schools, where our schools are supposed to be safe. And so developing policies, developing initiatives, developing trainings, programs is essential for us as a state to be able to ensure that all students are treated equitably and given every opportunity for a successful academic life, which will build into a future adult life. And so I appreciate and the commitment that this board has when it comes to diversity and equity. And as an access committee, we really look forward to working with you in partnership to come together and to develop a stronger plan to help all of our students. So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you all.
Oh, thank you so much. And especially thank you for that story. It echoes what many of my students say, unfortunately. And I think you're right. It sticks with them forever and it embeds in them. Board Member Earl, do you have another question?
No, I'd like to make a motion.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to make a motion that we accept the recommendations and that we just acknowledge the hard work that has been done here. When I've attended the Access Committee, I've always appreciated the thoughtfulness of the individuals there. I would encourage us to look beyond just one ideology as you're reaching out because individuals like Carol Swain, Robert Woodson, and others are moving some of the dialogue forward as far as unity, not being so divisive in our nation. So I would encourage us to also make sure we're looking at a broad range of individuals as we consult on this item. And especially, like I said, Utah law. So, well, anyways, that was a little bit of a, you get the general idea. So thank you for your hard work. We'll look forward to accepting those and looking at those.
Okay, if it's okay, I hope, Board Member Earl, I'm just going to say the motion, and if I miss something, you jump in and let me know. So the motion before the committee is that we recommend the board accept the recommendations in the access memo supporting underrepresented, oh my goodness, I have trouble with that word, underrepresented, historically marginalized, and underserved students. So, and also, as Board Member Earl says, a huge thank you to the hard work of the committee. Do we have any discussion to that motion? Board Member Cannon?
Yes. So these were put together by the Access Committee. We will take them to the board, and I foresee that they will likely pass the board. And then what happens? Do these go to staff to take some kind of action? I'm just wondering what the next step is for these recommendations.
So I wonder if Patty will speak to that, because my understanding is, yes, this is the step. This is a step towards that. And, you know, we have the Equity Steering Committee, we have some things in place. And if you look at like recommendation 5, for example, with curricula that supports inclusivity, you might remember that when we had our student advisory panel committee come talk to us, they talked about the social studies standards. Well, those are coming up, and I think that that would be something where we look at that and we make sure that our curricula supports inclusivity, marginalized groups, etc. But Patty, you can say that much more articulately than I can. So would you comment, please?
Yes, thank you. So as well as keeping the board informed, we are also going to be meeting back with Access Committee every time that they meet and let them know how we're coming on these and letting them know where we're at with them. So exactly as you talked to Chair Gravitt, we'll be looking at those through the lens of equity, which is part of the board's strategic plan, following the equity definitions that are already agreed upon by the board and moving this forward.
Thank you. Janet, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other discussion to the motion? Okay, seeing none, committee members, go ahead and vote. Board Member Earl, I'm assuming the hand means a yes. Oh, either way. Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, committee members.
Can I just, before, I don't know if Patty's still on.
Yeah. She's always on. She's everywhere.
Yeah. she's our main. She
flies around me when I command. Just kidding.
So items that are going on with this committee, this Equity Steering Committee, I don't know that everybody's familiar with those. You guys are meeting weekly, isn't that right?
So it's actually creating a culturally responsive workplace committee. And so right now we're just in the drafting phases of getting together what the goals are and some common vocabulary. And once we get some final drafts that are ready to show and discuss, then we can have more information. I know that right now one of the things that we're doing is getting all of the resources that we use in response to equity or any professional learning together, so that we can be fully transparent to the board at any time with everything that is going on. So yes, right now there's a steering committee that meets weekly, and then bi-monthly, I think this is correct. So if I'm wrong, I apologize, that we're meeting with a work group that is kind of going into 4 different areas, which is looking at what it looks like in accordance with our strategic plan. Hiring practices. Hiring practices really talks about looking at policies or practices that are in place that might discriminate against or discourage those that have previously been applying or looking towards advancement through USBE, not being able to have those opportunities. We're looking at data as well. And then our 4th area is, professional learning opportunities that might happen. I think that the thing that the board should know first is that because we are creating this, as we talked about, that we're not taking any theoretical lens, but we're really creating this from the needs of our our students and our staff and our teachers here that that input is vital. It's important, and that's why we're really trying to take our time in doing what's right before we go out to any school and have them think that we are the expert. We need to look within first.
So just once again, we're sticking within the framework of the laws, right? Civil rights laws for everyone.
Absolutely. And Board Member Earl, if you're referring to some of the memos, at least currently we are fully aware. I have those as part of the committee agenda items. The words to be used, the definitions that are on there, we're fully on it with what is can and cannot be used according to the laws, and what President Trump has just put out recently as well. So we're on it. We're aware of it. That's one of the reasons why we are talking about creating our own definitions.
Great, perfect. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Patty. Thank you for that question, Jenny. Okay, we're going to move on to our second action item. This one is the Board Resolution 2021, a resolution establishing the official position of the Utah State Board of Education concerning the SHARP survey. And to refresh your memory, committee, you probably remember last time we talked about this, we got into a discussion about the purpose of resolutions, and we didn't really get into the details of the resolution itself. So just to remind us, I think Jeffrey Van Holten is going to talk about, kind of give us some history context, the purpose of a resolution. And, you know, our job as a committee is we need to decide if we feel that a resolution is valuable enough to adopt. If we don't, then we don't take action. If we do, then we can look at the wording in the resolution itself. So Jeff, will you start us off on that discussion and give us some background?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. My internet connection is, I keep getting a message saying it is unstable. And so I will not turn my video on right now, just so that I can hopefully give you consistent audio. So yes, I was actually going to share with you a rap that I made up a while ago, but I couldn't find the words, and I'm not a rapper. So
I really just got excited for a minute. You can start later. The committee meeting next month. It'll be our poem. Yes. Okay.
Your poem next month will be my rap about resolutions.
Okay, that would make me so happy.
I did make one a while ago for a previous agency that I worked for when they wanted to learn about what is a resolution, and Hamilton had just hit the scene, so we did it Hamilton style. But I'll give you the calm version today. Resolution. I am going to switch my screen over to a different window, maybe, and share with you there's a board policy on resolutions, specifically for the board, and it defines what a resolution is. So that should be up on the screen now. And a resolution, as defined in Board Policy 2003, which is your policy on resolutions. Resolution means an approved statement that expresses the opinion of a majority of the board, but does not have the force of rule or law. So essentially, that is what a resolution is. That is what it is federally sometimes, and mostly on the state level as well. Typically, it is a statement of opinion that the majority agrees to in the state.
Jeff, we lost you. Are you back?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes. I mean, I lost you. I don't know if others did, but I couldn't hear you for about 5-10 seconds.
Oh, where did I leave you?
Missed the whole definition of a resolution all the way from the top.
Pretty much the definition. So
the meat of it all. Great.
I missed it too.
Okay. Feel free to interrupt me at any point if I cut out.
Okay, I'll do that.
My internet is being crazy. A resolution is a statement of opinion. So you've got the definition there on the screen. I'll highlight it for you. This is how you as the board, define a resolution for the board's purposes. And this is the same essentially as it is at the state level and sometimes at the federal level. So at the state level, you've seen a lot of resolutions, especially this last session. You may recall the one that encourages LEAs to have late start conversations internally about having late start high school. So that was a resolution. Nobody was required to have late start high school, right? It was just the legislature felt like LEA should talk about it. Same for you all. If you have a resolution, it is just an opinion. It doesn't require anybody do anything. So it wouldn't bind anyone. It would not do anything of that nature. I also wanted to just highlight in your policy that a resolution from the board, which is past this date of June 7th of 2018, would need to include a sunset date and could not be in existence for more than 4 years. So you have set a kind of a sunset on all your resolutions. You currently only have one in place, and it is a resolution you passed in 2016. So it actually expires this year. And that resolution was about the accountability system used by the state. So typically you're going to use resolutions for something like that, especially if you want to make a really strong political statement to someone like the legislature, for example. A resolution would be perfect. Which is exactly what you did 4 years ago about the accountability system. So that is what a resolution is. Hopefully that gives you a good sense of what it is you're considering and if it fits what you're trying to accomplish. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Chair Gravitt, and I'm available for any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So committee members, I want to turn it back to you and see if you have any questions about the purpose of resolution. And we need to decide as a committee if, yes, a resolution is something we want to adopt, or do we not want to adopt it? If we say we do, then we'll get into the words of the actual resolution. So committee members, I'm looking for a discussion or questions about just even adopting a resolution. Board Member Hanson, go ahead.
Thanks. And I am going to speak not against necessarily the content of this resolution, but just against the idea of putting this into a resolution. And I've talked with Jenny about this as well, with Board Member Earl. I feel like we have so many priorities on our plate, so many important things, and I have a hard time elevating this maybe above many of the other things that we're dealing with and putting a resolution in place. I feel like if we did put a resolution in place here, I would have to put 15 or 20 more resolutions out there just to show that they're all of equal priority or of high priority for me. So I believe there are ways to get changes made to the SHARP survey, ways to interact better with the other players with the SHARP survey. And I think that we're making some headway there. And Board Member Earl's been, I think, instrumental in doing a lot of that. But I would speak against the resolution today and then speak in favor of us continuing to work with our co-stakeholders in the SHARP survey to make improvements as we see necessary.
Oh, thank you so much, Board Member Hanson. Board Member Earl, go ahead.
Yes, we had some dialogue yesterday a little bit about this, and I still feel like the resolution, if this group feels like it should move forward, is not a negative thing, or I think it's proactive. Actually, I'd like us to see us move some of these surveys and things into a positive direction, and to be cautious about what we're putting on those surveys. But I do know that oh goodness, Brian, what's Brian's name?
Olmsted.
Yeah, Olmsted has worked with our other partners to work on some of these items, and they've worked to change some of those, and down the road they're going to look at some of the other items. So I do feel like there is an impact going on there, and that we're addressing some of the concerns. This would just be an overall board, right? It's, the whole board would be saying yes, or this is an interest that we have. So either way, if we don't move it forward, then if we move it forward, I do have an amendment to the bottom. If we don't move it forward, then we'll continue that work behind the scenes. So,
okay. Thank you, Board Member Earl. Board Member Cannon?
Thank you. As I read through this, I had a lot of questions come to my mind, like, is the SHARP survey a good thing? How do we know it's a good thing? What action has been taken as a result of us gathering this information? What trends have been tracked? What resources have been deployed? What prevention programs have been done as a result of this? I guess I felt like I wanted to have some documentation about the benefits and the positive nature of this before moving forward with a resolution. So I don't know, maybe we have that information. It wasn't included with this, but could someone speak about the trends that have been tracked, the resources that have been deployed? How have things become better because of this? What is the motivation for us to take action on this type of resolution?
Right. And I think we'll have Brian Olmsted respond to your questions, Board Member Cannon. I think it's important to remember that as a board, we are not in charge of the SHARP survey. We have really no final say, but I think that Brian could probably speak to some of your questions. Brian, are you available?
I am. Yes, certainly a lot of information has come from the SHARP survey. So we're looking now at trends and data from 2003, and so we're approaching 2 decades worth of information, and so we've seen rises in underage drinking, and we're seeing now stabilization and actually decreasing in that. We're seeing the rise in suicide rates. Of course, we've seen that. We've also now seen through our prevention efforts a flattening of that curve, and even a start to dip in certain places. And so just having the data available is massively important to know that you're addressing an actual data point rather than trying to think of what you remember or project something. You can use the data, and the way it's used across the state, both locally in community coalitions, so local education agencies, in community coalitions, and even as a state, we've used our SHARP survey data to apply for federal awards. And so the resources implemented just within our own agency, we have right now about $45 million of at-risk funding that is often targeted at the local level, specifically from things they see in their survey data. And so it is used just in lots of ways, and that's just at the state board. I couldn't speak to how Department of Health and the division is using that, but I know they have also received grants. It's important. I would say I appreciate the recent I'll say uptick in conversation around the SHARP survey. I think the committee that produces the SHARP survey is also thankful for a revived conversation, and as we continue to make it better, it just helps everybody.
Thank you, Brian. And I will just say again, as a teacher, I see the effects in my own school because data equals funding, and we get funding for things that we need based on data we get from the SHARP survey. Board Member Cannon, does that help answer your question, or do you need a follow-up?
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions or discussion? If not, I would be looking for a motion whether or not to move forward with a resolution or to not move forward with a resolution. Board Member Earl?
Well, I'm going to move that we move forward with the resolution, and then we can vote one way or the other and have that discussion, and then we can go from there. So that's my motion, is to move forward with the resolution.
Hey, thank you so much for that motion. So the motion before the committee is that we move forward with adoption. Well, I'm just going to say it like it is in here because I think it matches. That we forward a recommendation to the board for the adoption of Board Resolution 2021. Is there any discussion to that motion? And actually, Board Member Earl, I think I know what you're going to say, but you say it because I think I just. What's
that? Well, I'm just going to say I don't know if this is where you were going, but that I do feel like this is an important item. It does. There are extensive amounts of data that are collected, and there are a number of organizations that use this, and so our influence in this realm is very important. It's noticed across the state as we meet with these different organizations, and there's a lot of data there. So anyways, that's my reason why. So.
Okay. I was just wondering if you wanted me to take back the moving the specific resolution and just be more general, because I know you wanted to do an amendment.
Oh,
but if you're okay.
I did have an amendment. You're right. I'm sorry.
So that's why I was just going to adjust.
Let's do, yeah, whether
okay.
we.
That's what as soon as I said it, I was like, oh, I bet you're going to correct me, and you should have.
Well, so I didn't even think about that, so I'm glad you did.
So let me just, committee members, let me just adjust the motion to say that the motion before the committee is to move forward in adopting a resolution for the SHARP survey.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Jenny. Is there any more discussion to that motion? I know Board Member Hanson talked about his reasons already for not supporting a resolution. Board Member Cannon or Board Member Marsh, would you like to weigh in on that? Okay, if there's no other discussion, let's go ahead and vote. Committee members, we are voting again on whether or not we are moving forward with a resolution about the SHARP survey, not this specific resolution, but for a resolution. So go ahead and vote now. Okay, the motion passes with Board Members Earl, Board Member Cannon, and Marsh voting yes, and Board Member Hanson and me voting no. So that motion passes. So with that, go ahead and clear your boards. I feel like we're playing bingo. Clear your boards, committee. Let's now get into the specific resolution itself. Brian, I'm going to turn it back to you. If you'll just kind of go over the wording of the SHARP, the resolution concerning the SHARP survey, and tell us anything that we might need to be aware of, refresh our memories, and then we'll get into the content after you do that.
Okay, I would like to just clear up one piece of information. I believe on our agenda, this is listed as a discussion item today, and so I'm just curious as to what end action we are able to take as a committee, and that I'll leave that up to you to figure that out. But I just want to remind us that we did decide that this is a discussion item on the agenda.
Yes, thank you for that. I remember that discussion, but then I saw that it wasn't changed, so I assumed we kept it as an action item.
Is it? Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it looks like on the overarching agenda that is public facing, it declares it as a discussion item, but then when you click on the agenda memo, it was not changed within the agenda memo, which would put it as an action item. So I defer to Jeff to be able to say, since the public facing agenda, which is for the Open and Public Meetings Act, would show that a reasonable person would look and see that it was a discussion instead of an action, would we need to defer to the the overarching list instead of the detail? Jeff?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Sorry, it does not like me muting and unmuting. So it is listed as a discussion item on the agenda, and I'm just looking at the agenda itself and what was posted, and it does list it in a category as discussion item. So to take any action, members of the public would not have known that action would have been taken, so they may wanted to have come and commented or not. But and Angie, I might defer to you a little bit here because I know the Open and Public Meetings Act does not technically apply to our committee hearings. So you may have the way to actually take action, if I'm mistaken.
That's
Brian.
Yeah, I'll chime in. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, Jeff, is I don't think Open and Public Meetings Act applies. So even though it's listed as discussion, I think this committee can do what it wants. Unless Angie has another insight or Michelle, but that's my sense of it.
No, I was going to agree with you, Brian, that because it's a less than committee of 8, this committee doesn't have the authority to take this action on your own. It then goes to the full board. The other thing I was just going to mention is that the action, discussion, distinction sometimes isn't as important as it is to have the topic noticed. And so the fact that the topic is noticed is key, but you as a committee or as board members can decide whether you think that discussion flag may have caused some people to not pay attention or not attend or provide public comment. So I think that's really up to you as a committee to decide the weight on that. But as Brian stated, there's no real legal risk here.
Okay, thank you for that. That's why it confused me, because when you look into the agenda, it still says action. And I think as a committee, we could actually, depending on what the committee wants to do, we know that we want a resolution. We could bring this back. Committee members could have time to add amendments or talk about things. Brian, I don't know if it would be beneficial to you to have another month. Let me see what Board Member Earl has to say, and then we'll go from there.
I just have one amendment to this, but if there's others that wanted to add stuff, then
okay. Let me just see. I won't call on you, but by raise of hand with committee members, just raise your hand if you have amendments that you want to make to this resolution. I'm only seeing Board Member Earl. So with that, if it's okay with everyone, I think it might be good to make the amendment, and then if we're okay legally, let's just take the action and get it checked off. So Board Member Earl, what amendment are you looking at? I guess we first would need a motion.
I can make that motion too.
Okay, thank you.
I move that the Standards and Assessment Committee forward a recommendation to the board for adoption of Board Resolution 2020-1.
Okay, thank you, Board Member Earl. So the motion before the committee is that the Standards and Assessment Committee forward a recommendation to the board for adoption of Board Resolution 2020-1. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Earl.
Yes, I have a recommended amendment down at the very bottom where it says, be it further resolved that the State Board of Education urges the Sharp Survey Planning Committee beginning on the 2023 administration. I would like to change what's there because we technically cannot, that's something out of our control, whether parents choose to have their parents take this or not. But I would like to change that to, sorry, now I've got my words here. Brian helped me a little bit earlier, but I should have wrote it down instead of, we were talking about it, beginning in the, to encourage online administration. That's what it is. To encourage online administration for ease of use and skip logic utilization. And Brian can talk to what that skip logic utilization is. So,
okay.
Want me to read it again?
I think I have it. So, okay. The amendment is to change the bullet point underneath the be it further resolved section from to encourage 100% participation for online administration to encourage online administration for ease of use and skip logic utilization.
Yes.
Oh, it's already on there. Brian, will you just speak to what skip logic utilization is for our committee?
You bet. Yeah, this is is that my echo or someone else's? I'll just keep going. This is the power of online survey, where if you've answered a question, like say there's a question about 30-day use of tobacco and then lifetime use of tobacco, if you indicate you've never used tobacco, there's no reason to ask you any more questions about your tobacco use. You've already declared, I have no tobacco use history, and so you wouldn't ask all those follow-up questions. And so skip logic, the utilization of that really allows an online tool to represent itself as a very concise and succinct survey, rather than where sometimes there might be 150 questions behind the scenes, or you might see 57 of them. And so it allows a student to move through effectively in an efficient manner.
Thank you, Brian. And I just have to say, I appreciate this recommendation, because this would dramatically cut down on the time spent taking the survey, which is my only concern as a teacher. Is it does take time. It's great information. Patty, you have something to say?
I just wanted to be clear in the way that it's worded. If it clearly states without any context for conversation for someone reading it that hasn't listened to this. So the way it's reading is to encourage online administration for ease of use and skip logic utilization. Brian, is there any other form of that they're giving the SHARP survey other than online? Because this means that they're going to encourage online instead of paper and pencil, the way it's worded in reading it just straight out.
Correct. So currently, the SHARP survey is a paper pencil administration. The committee's talking about moving to online, and what this resolution would say is that the board is encouraging, in fact, the strong recommendation by 2023 to be completely online.
Perfect. That's exactly what I needed, the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Patty. And I agree with that completely, this amendment. So any other discussion to the amendment to the motion? Board Member Earl, do you have something else to add to that?
No, is my hand still up?
Okay, you're just waiting. So let me then, since there's no more discussion to the amendment, let's vote on the amendment. So the amendment before the committee is to change the words to encourage 100% participation in online administration to, you can see it in blue on the screen, to encourage online administration for ease of use and skip logic utilization. So all those in favor of the amendment, well, please vote now on the amendment. Okay, Board Member Marsh? Board Member Marsh, are you there? I'm going to say, maybe he'll come up, maybe we lost him for a minute, but that motion passes unanimously with the exception we do not have a vote from Board Member Marsh. Okay, now we're back to the original motion. The original motion is the Standards and Assessment Committee forward a recommendation to the board for adoption of Board Resolution 2020-1 as amended. Any discussion to that motion? Board Member Hanson.
Thanks. Just a couple of questions. First, so on the first whereas, we say the purpose of the SHARP survey is to assess adolescent substance use. And on the third whereas, we say that it's been administered since 2003 for the purpose of tracking trends. I don't know. I guess we have multiple purposes. I don't know. I think the overall purpose is to assess, or maybe we can combine those two. I'm not sure. That seemed confusing to me. And then the second question is about the guiding principles. Are these the only guiding principles, and how were these selected versus maybe other principles that might be out there? Are these really principles, or are these just measures that we want to have in place as we administer and create the SHARP survey? Just those two questions, please.
Okay, thank you. Brian, will you respond to those two concerns, the purpose and then also the guiding principles?
Yeah, absolutely. So the purpose, you're right, should probably find maybe a different word for that third whereas.
Yeah.
Because it does state then that there's two purposes. I think the main purpose is the first whereas. Mm-hmm. So we could look at editing that. So the guiding principles, these bullets, I pulled those out of recent conversations and the recent work of the committee, kind of the current crop of questions, like, where are we going with this type of thing? Is it necessary? I have some examples of some of those. But so that's where they came from. It was just my homework, I'll call it. And certainly this would be the place where I would see the board adding or subtracting what they want. I feel like the whereases are kind of like fact. Mm-hmm. And then these guiding principles are the pieces and parts that I and my team, as we meet with the committee, right, that we will use those as we help guide the development of the survey. And so that really is the nuts and bolts, and these 6 different things were like I say, just pulled out of recent conversations and the current work that we're doing and have done to be ready for the 2021, and as we now think of 2023.
Okay, thank you. And I'm looking at the second purpose. And Scott, I'm wondering if it would be better just to say, since 2003, in order to track trends, deploy resources, and inform prevention programs. Like, would that lose the meaning? Or Brian, would that retain the meaning?
I think that's perfect. I think the main point is that the longevity, the since 2003, and let's not break this. Let's keep our winning streak going.
Okay, and Scott, does that ring true to you? Would that be okay to make that change? Because if so, I'll make that amendment now. If you're okay with that, let me repeat it again. Whereas the survey has been administered biennially since 2003, in order to track trends, deploy resources, and inform prevention programs. Is that congruent with what you were seeing, Scott?
Yep. I just didn't like the confusion of there being two.
No, that's great, because purpose feels like a big word, and then to throw it into the whereas where we've already talked about the purpose. So,
follow-up question on the guiding principles.
Yeah, go ahead.
Again, I'm struggling, and maybe it's just words, but words are important.
Yes.
I wonder if these are guidelines rather than guiding principles.
Okay, thank you. I was going to suggest guidelines too, because it's like a principle feels bigger.
Guiding principles about eliminating bias. There's guiding principles about all kinds of things to try to make this a fair survey, I guess, so that we don't have those things happen. I don't know that we want to include all those, because some of them are just basic to a survey, but guidelines might fit better. And I didn't draft this. I just wonder if that word might work better for the kind of things that we're listing.
I like the following guidelines instead of the following guiding principles. Let me just see what other committee members think. I know we're kind of just doing this on the fly a little bit. Other committee members, do you have comment on those 2 changes that we've made?
This is Board Member Earl. I think those are completely appropriate. I think it tidies it up, makes it concise. So.
Okay.
This is Board Member Cannon. I'm fine with the amendments. Just a question: is the SHARP survey something that is unique to the state of Utah, or is this something that is utilized in other states?
Brian, I think it's used in other states, but Brian, go ahead.
You bet. Yeah. So the SHARP survey is actually a combination of, of 2 surveys. Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is national. It's a CDC, and then Prevention Needs Assessment, which is implemented in many states, but not all. So it's a very common it's a very common survey method and survey subject, right? It's happening in many other states, but it's not, you can't say it's national.
Okay. Board Member Cannon, is that good?
And so would you then say that the way we have combined these two surveys makes this unique to the state of Utah?
I don't know if other states, we combined it because they're so common rather than, and there actually used to be a third one, was a specific tobacco survey. Mm-hmm. And because they were so common in what they were getting to, and then the fact that they did everything, they put them all together. I can't speak to whether that's happened in other states or not. I know we did that specifically in Utah. But again, I not being involved at that time in those decisions, it may have been happening, like in our region or even, across the nation. I don't know about that.
Okay. Remember, Hanson, is that okay now? I know it doesn't quite answer the question, but.
Board Member Cannon.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just call it unique, okay? Because Board Member Marsh, you have a question?
Not really a question. I just agree with what they're wanting to do by making the amendments here.
Okay. Great, thank you. Board Member Hanson?
I'm sorry.
Okay. I muted.
I'm fine with the way this looks now.
Okay. So if it's okay, it looks like the amendments we made and we kind of just did it. I'm hoping we can just say as amended. If that's not okay, somebody speak up and stop me. But I'm going to restate the motion and then just say as amended. And then we'll go from there. So the motion before the committee is that the Standards and Assessment Committee forward a recommendation to the board for adoption of Board Resolution 2020-1 as amended. And committee, you can look on the screen to see that we changed for the purpose of in order to track trends, deploy resources, and inform prevention programs. And then below, we changed guiding principles to guidelines. So is there any discussion to that motion? Seeing none, go ahead and vote. Okay, that motion passes with one dissent, and the yay votes are me, Board Member Earl, Board Member Cannon, and Board Member Mark Marsh, and then the nay vote is Board Member Hanson. Okay, thank you, committee. Thank you, Brian, for all your hard work on this and for being there for all our many questions and concerns.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good Friday. Okay, our next action item is the Assessment and Accountability Advisory Committee recommendations. And this one, so you can look in the background that the Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee met on September 16th, specifically to review pending state assessment administration and then the implications we have for the 2020 suspension of assessment and how we calculate student growth percentiles. There are two recommendations, and Darren, I don't know how you feel about this, but I wondered if we could do one recommendation at a time and vote on it, unless you think it would be better to do both at the same time. But if that's the case, Darren, would you talk about just give us an overview of this and then talk about recommendation number 1, and then we'll vote on that. And then I will have you talk about recommendation number 2 and we will vote on that, if that's okay.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. My name is Darren Nielsen. I'm Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning for the Utah State Board of Education, and I'm happy to be with you this afternoon, even though it's just virtually. As you mentioned, Chair, the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee, or APAC, met on the 16th of September and discussed a variety of issues. And out of those discussions, as you referred to already, I came up with 2 recommendations for board action or proposed board action. One thing that I would like to point out is there's not a recommendation to suspend assessment. As you know, last spring, the board took decisive action in March or the first part of April, I don't remember the exact date, to recommend suspension of state assessment as COVID-19 began to substantially impact our communities in the state of Utah. As the committee talked about assessments going into this year with a given number of uncertainties that still exist in our educational settings, we see that Salt Lake City School District is still in a virtual-only delivery model. Many school districts across the state have face-to-face delivery models for educational services, and then we see almost daily on the news a school here or a school there that goes into a short-term closure or moves to an online learning for a short period of time. Given all of those uncertainties, the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee still sees great value in assessment data, statewide assessment data as we move through this year, and is not in a position at this point to recommend the suspension of state assessment because of the value that we can obtain through we as a system, we as communities, we as our parents and other stakeholders can get from data if we're able to proceed forward with administration. So these recommendations, again, are made based on the assumption that we'll be able to deliver statewide assessments to some degree in a normal setting as we have in the past. As you know, our accountability system utilizes state assessment to a large degree. Our high school accountability system has incorporated other indicators that are not dependent on state assessment, but for the most part, state assessment is a critical element of our accountability system. And within that umbrella, the calculation of student growth is a significant part of that overall process. When calculating student growth, or student growth percentiles is the term that we use, there is a requirement in our technical manual that in order for a student to have a student growth percentile, they're required to have 2 consecutive years of achievement growth in that content area. So 2 years of language arts, or 2 years of math, or 2 years of science. On the second year, then, we're able to calculate, using student growth percentiles, a student growth score. And we can look at a trajectory because we've also calculated or determined a student growth target for each of our students in each content area. Having missed assessment in the spring of 2020, we now are in a position where we're unable to calculate student growth percentiles in the way that we have previously for our accountability system or for individual student growth scores that we provide to parents and to educators. So the committee talked about alternative methods or strategies to be able to calculate growth. And you'll see in the document, there was discussion around what's called the skip year growth calculation model. And it's not an uncommon model. It's not utilized in Utah. And there are some states that use that for their growth in their traditional system as well. But it essentially allows us to skip a year. So we would take students' growth or student achievement scores from 2017, or in this case, 2019, skip 2020, and then assuming we have scores in 2021, use the skip growth method to calculate a student growth percentile. The Center for Assessment ran analysis on our data, went back and looked at the 2017 to 2019 and calculated skip year growth to see what kind of impact that had. In the document that we provided, it talks about they found, and I'll just read this, the resulting analysis found differences between skip year and 1 year median growth percentiles very significantly for individual schools, and that the difference in mean or median SGPs for schools are likely large enough to impact accountability growth scores for schools. Remembering that the MGP, or median growth percentile, is derived from the student growth percentile, but the MGP is not actually used in school accountability. This time in this analysis, we didn't determine what kind of changes we would have seen in the accountability system, but we do know that there were differences and they were noticeable by using the skip year growth calculation on previous years of data. Those were under what would be considered normal circumstances, and the thought and prospect of us performing that same statistical function during a year where we have abnormal circumstances aggravates and creates additional challenges in the prospect of utilizing skip year growth to calculate our student growth percentiles. In the end, the committee recommended, and this was a unanimous recommendation, that the board does not calculate skip year growth for accountability purposes. Board member Cannon and board member Earl were part of the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee and involved in those discussions. And they know that we still see value in calculating skip year growth. And this recommendation, I just want to highlight, doesn't direct the board or staff not to use skip year growth for other purposes, but not to use it for accountability purposes. And that's the recommendation that's coming forward, or the first recommendation that's coming forward from the APAC committee.
Thank you, Darren. Committee members, do you have questions about recommendation number 1 or anything else to ask Darren about skip year growth? Board member Hanson, go ahead.
Thanks. And thanks, Darren, for that explanation. I just have a question about the skip year growth and the differences that we saw between the skip year and the 1 year median growth percentiles. It says they vary significantly. Was it a shift? Did we see a shift, or we just saw a lot more variance introduced by doing the, was it a consistent shift, or was there a lot more variance than we did this?
Overall in the system, it was just more variance, not necessarily a shift one way or another, other than there's a reduced reliability because you have a year missing versus when you calculate student growth using 2 consecutive years of achievement data. There's more consistency that way.
Oh, that's helpful for me. Thank you for asking that question, Scott.
I do have a couple more, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
So I understand we saw the difference, but you also said that other states are regularly using skip year calculations. So would we, and I understand we saw more variation, but they're somehow making that work. Is there something that we're missing when we're trying to apply this, or are their systems just inherently more unreliable because they're using skip year?
Yeah, so that's debatable, huh? But, the reason that it's problematic for us is because we've been using a traditional year-over-year growth calculation, and then introducing a change into our calculation system that makes it difficult. So for instance, if you have a child in one of our schools and they have a student growth percentile score, they get a score that then factors into the accountability system. And their teachers see that score on their school roster, their student roster. And let's say the score is, so your child gets a 66 for the student growth percentile last year, or 2 years ago. We missed a year. Now we bring in a skip year model, and we say that your student got a 52 student growth percentile. You as a parent are going to be inclined to think that number means the same thing. It's got the same label, student growth percentile. You for a number of years have seen, or your teacher, your child's teacher anyway, has seen these student growth percentiles over time. And it's the fact that we're introducing a different system or a different calculation into our existing system that's part of the challenge. And then when you throw into the mix, the COVID-19 and the disruptions that has brought into our educational delivery system, it creates risk for misinterpretation of what that data means as much as some of these other problems.
So just to follow on that, so the committee felt that it would be preferable to have nothing in that column to compare, rather than have a number in the column and then have an asterisk that says, this was calculated using a different method.
Yeah, so the committee, I don't remember specific discussions about the risk of misinterpreting the data, but in looking at the analysis that the Center for Assessment did and listening to the case made around the variances and the challenges that come with introducing skip year growth into this model for accountability purposes, and again, I'll go back to that. The recommendation is not to forego calculating student growth because it's an important a tool for research and analysis on the impacts of COVID-19 for our students in the areas of language, arts, math, and science, particularly grades 3 through 8. But in terms of using it for accountability, it's not advisable, and the committee was unanimously supporting that decision or that position.
Because of the inherent variability that we're introducing, the increased variability, is that the reason? Yes. And then nationally, you'll see that your point about, or the point we were talking about briefly a minute ago about misinterpreting those results or applying the same frame of reference that you had from previous years is a significant barrier or challenge, and introduces into the system some potential risk for injury to either educational settings or individual students or individual groups of students. And then one more question. Thank you for that explanation. I understand much better now. So I understand we're in the middle of COVID, and I understand that things have changed a lot, and we had a lot of differences in the different schools, but we are still proceeding with education. We're funding teachers, we're funding schools, we're funding curriculum. We're expecting schools to engage students and move forward. How do we hold schools accountable for that? I understand maybe because of the handicaps of COVID, we may not achieve the same level that we would achieve in a normal year, but there still should be achievement. There still should be progress for the students. And I'm just trying to get that straight in my head. I don't want to do away with all accountability, I guess. I want to say maybe we should, instead of 10%, if that's what we were after before, it should be 5% this year because of the handicap. Throwing out the concept, but can you address that? Can you help me with that? Yeah, it's a great question, Board Member Hanson. There aren't definitive answers across the country on that. There is a lot of discussion about taking this year and making it an opportunity to rebuild or to redesign accountability systems. This concept that an accountability system should really point to the things that your system values the most, and that assessment shouldn't be built necessarily for an accountability system. Assessment has its purpose, and then an accountability system includes the elements in our educational environment that we deem to be the most important or vital. So there are some voices that are talking about using this as an opportunity to try to redesign or introduce additional indicators. Utah does have, especially for secondary school settings, indicators that are not dependent on simply an assessment associated with one set of core standards. And their school report card, the digital school report card to that point was published yesterday, including those elements that we were able to provide to the public: graduation rate, post-secondary attainment, post-secondary readiness. Those are examples of some of the indicators and the data that we were able to publish for our public to consume and be able to look at and make determinations about their school quality. So this concept of states could introduce additional indicators into their accountability system. There's a lengthy discussion, and the notes for APAC talk a little bit about this opportunity to learn data, trying to introduce information into your accountability system, or at least to your analysis of the impacts of COVID-19. These elements around trying to include measurements about were the students delivered, were their instruction delivered face-to-face, blended, or wholly online? How many interactions did they have with their teachers on a regular basis? What kind of engagement did they have? And obviously, there's lots of challenges with us being able to obtain that kind of data. What kind of access students have or student groups have to the internet? And then there's a long list that assessment experts across the country are starting to build, and encourages states to start to look for ways to collect that data. I guess the question comes, Board Member Hanson, is if we publish, if we're concerned about the quality of our data, which we are. Assessment experts are worried about the quality of the data we're going to achieve this year or get this year.
assuming we are able to collect significant amounts of the data we're used to seeing in our system to be able to analyze and potentially use for accountability. The question really is, if we have concerns with that data, is it better to proceed forward in using that data, even though we have concerns or questions about its integrity and its validity, or is it better to set that aside in the essence of trying to do no harm or have information misinterpreted or misused and redirecting resources inappropriately to either certain schools or certain student groups? But yeah, your question is a difficult one, and there's not definitive answers right now on accountability for the school year that we're entering.
Well, and my concern, and this will be the last one. Sorry, Chair.
No, these are great questions. Thank you.
I don't know, and I don't think any of us know how long this COVID situation is going to continue and how long students are going to be bouncing from face-to-face models to home and quarantine and all the different things that are there. And if we don't have a way to measure growth in this environment, how long does that persist? If we say because of COVID, we don't have an accurate way to hold schools, teachers accountable, and how long we give them a pass this year, and then next year, if the conditions are the same, we what do we do then? Or what comes next? That's kind of my question. And my mindset, I guess, is that if we have some data, we could asterisk it like we have in the past when we had problems with the test delivery, and at least take a stab at some kind of accountability, maybe with lower expectations, because I believe that's the case. But was that discussion had in the committee? And I'm sorry, you guys were all in the committee and I wasn't there, so I'm asking you to summarize. But that's my last question.
Thank you, Board Member Hanson.
Let me jump in and just point out there are the two motions, and the reason they're separated is intentional. So this first motion wouldn't necessarily require that there is no accountability for this coming year. It says just to not use it for growth. So you had alluded to earlier, you could rebuild your accountability system, reduce, so don't use growth in it at all, just use achievement, use the other indicators that we have. The next recommendation is the one that's more substantial, and really, I think your questions are more pointed to the next motion that the committee is bringing to the board.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. I thought the same thing, because the first one doesn't deal with not having accountability, just not using the skip year growth. Board Member Earl, do you have a question or comment on recommendation number 1?
I probably just have a comment more than a question, because I did say meetings, but just a couple of thoughts. I know that and this has to do with the accountability, not necessarily not collecting information about how kids are doing, that kind of a thing, but it begins to be pressurized as we push towards the accountability of the state and the federal government at a time when teachers are already stressed to make sure their kids are, to doing what they're doing. So it's not a matter of, we do want information. I think the concern is that, and I think I heard this from educators and other leaders, is that the concern is that pressure that is put on our educators, and they're doing the best they can right now. They're doing great things with what they've been given. The interesting thing is, and I think in my mind, where does that accountability need to be? And ideally, it would be back within the homes and the families with the educator themselves, right? But it's hard to measure that. That's the hard to measure part. It isn't necessarily numbers. It's more the success on moving forward. And if there are ways to do that, I guess we would, I don't know. That's something to think about, right? That's where we'll measure real success, not on the numbers at the end of the year. One other thought, I'm not a fan, and I did mention this to Darren, of the opportunity to learn type of thing where we're just gathering more and more information from kids. I am a fan of us knowing what's successful. And if we can do that without extending an assessment, adding a whole bunch of questions at the end of their test, if we end up doing the test, if there's other ways to do that through parents or educators or whatever, I think that's a better way to do that than to try to collect more and more information from kids. Anyways, those are my thoughts. Not everyone felt that same way, but I just wanted to put those out there.
Oh, and Board Member Earl, I just have to say, like, I just almost started crying because even just this talk of accountability, when as a teacher in my brain, I'm like, oh my gosh, how do you measure success? Well, I'm showing up. I'm making the day through without sobbing. I'm getting kids there, like they're feeling safe. Like there's so many other things we are dealing with right now that assessment, I mean, we're working on learning every day, but assessment is probably furthest from our mind, to tell you the truth, but it doesn't mean we are not engaging in the learning. So thank you so much from a teacher for that comment. Board Member Marsh.
Thank you, Chair Gravitt. I think I kind of want to comment a little bit on what Jenny and yourself are talking about. A skip year, the growth part of it, of how fast the student's growing, not real applicable, I don't think, for the situation that we're in, but we can learn from what ways might be the best ways to proceed forward in delivering the learning to the child, because some kids are mixed, some are straight online, some are straight face-to-face, and kind of look at those and use those for an accountability and to make sure that they've been given that opportunity. But there's so many variables. Are mom and dad able to be home to help them with the studies? Are the kids doing it on there by themselves? Are there some that are not motivated? Are there others that are just super motivated and they're all over it and doing a great job? And so with the variables in there, I think it just makes it hard to do something along the growth lines of the student. But I think we can learn from the data that we get on best practices for delivery of the education.
Thank you for that comment, Board Member Marsh, and it resonates with me again, just because as I've kind of surveyed my students, it just runs the gamut. You have kids who didn't read a single thing since March, and you have kids who had no support from parents. And really, my students are just learning how to learn again. And that's where I am as a teacher. I'm slowing things down because my kids need tolerance to learn and sustain that. So it's just a tough situation. But thank you for your comments. Any other comments before I'm looking for a motion on recommendation number 1? Board Member Marsh.
Oh, if Mark's not ready.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Okay.
I was going to say I'd like to make a motion that that we. Well, I got to see how I want to say this. But we recommend that the board does not calculate skip year growth for accountability purposes.
Okay, so I'm just going to phrase it, if it's okay. The motion before the committee is that we accept recommendation number 1, which is the board does not calculate skip year growth for accountability purposes, to forward to the full board for review and approval. Is there any discussion to that first motion? Seeing none, go ahead and vote on recommendation number 1. Okay, that motion carries unanimously. Thank you, committee. And now we're going to move on to recommendation number 2. Darren, will you talk about recommendation number 2 now?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. A lot of what we've talked about also applies to this recommendation. I do want to take just a moment to talk about the difference between accountability and analyzing our data for the purpose of identifying practices that were effective, have been effective during COVID-19, and those that maybe have been less effective. I was in a national webinar last night put on by the Hunt Institute, and they referenced a survey, which I wasn't familiar with. They claimed it was a national survey to parents, and they said 89% of parents on that survey want to know the academic impacts of COVID-19 on their children. And when they said that resonated with me. I'm a parent of 2 children, and I certainly have concerns and have interest in knowing what the impacts of both the previous months and these coming months are going to have on my children's academic readiness and skills and knowledge. So as we talk about moving forward with assessment, which is the first part of the memo that I provided the board, and recognizing that the committee feels like academic achievement and growth data is needed as much this year as in any year that we've ever had before. staff at USB are preparing, again, assuming we'll be able to collect assessment data as we would like to and as we have in the past, at least to a large degree in the spring of 2021. We're preparing to do a couple of pieces of analysis that our technical advisory committee has provided us support on. One would be using the skip year growth and going back, remembering that our English language arts and math standards and assessments have been the same since 2014. We've had some changes with science standards, so we don't have some of that longitudinal comparable data there that we have in math and language arts. To do SGP to MGP analysis. Then we also have vertical scale scores associated with our what was SAGE and now is RISE. So each student gets a vertical scale score, and we're able to do quite a bit of analysis to go back and look at that by student groups, by schools, by other groupings, and come up with predictions. And then as we complete the testing, we'll be able to look for variances or differences in what the outcomes are. So when we talk about not moving forward with accountability, it's important to understand, Chair Gravitt kind of alluded to this, it's important to understand that doing analysis on the data that we have available, whether it's a teacher doing that in the classroom, the principal doing that in their building, district, or the state doing it on behalf of the state, the schools, and the classrooms, that's one thing. And then trying to use that data to determine the quality of a school, the quality of instructional services being delivered, that's a different step. And so the recommendation that the committee is making is not associated with not collecting, making efforts to collect data, analyze the data, and provide that information to our students, their parents, teachers, school administrators, and the community, but not making inferences that the data that we're going to collect at the end of this year would then be easily inferred on the quality of the instructional services that those students received. And so that's probably all I'd like to say on this, and then take questions, obviously, from the committee.
Okay, thank you so much, Darren. Committee members, do you have any questions for Darren on recommendation number 2? Not seeing any questions. If there are no questions, is somebody ready to make a motion for a I see a question. Board Member Cannon.
Yes. So I remember reading that the federal government was going to stick to its guns and require states to give them accountability information for in spring of 2021. Is that correct?
Great question. Secretary DeVos released a memo. It's maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. And that memo was very clear that they do not expect or plan, they being the U.S. Department of Education, do not anticipate granting waivers for state assessment requirements. And they went into that memo several reasons and provide a rationale for that. Much of the same of what we've been talking about today about the importance of collecting data and trying to make meaning of what's happened, try to understand and try to learn from the conditions that our children and teachers have been placed in over the last several months and into the coming months. It was interesting, though, that in that memo, she or her staff did not write about accountability. So they've been silent to some degree. They, being the U.S. Department of Education, has been silent to some degree on accountability waivers. So again, whether the federal government would grant waivers for accountability, or whether we would need to make amendments or create an addendum to our consolidated plan for federal accountability, that's yet to be determined. If the board, if this committee, and then the full board passes this motion or this recommendation, that would put into play a series of things that staff would need to do moving forward. And again, the timing of this is still in a positive place for the State Board of Education, remembering that we're still prior to the Utah legislative session for state accountability considerations. and we still have some time because taking actions with the federal U.S. Department of Education, assuming that they won't grant wide-scale waivers like they did last spring on accountability. Remembering assessment, they've said they're not going to. Accountability, they've remained silent on to this point. Then it still gives staff time to go through the steps, the public review period, and several other things that would have to happen to try to put those things in place.
So, how do you separate your assessment data from your accountability data?
Yeah, so in the statute, so we'll just take the federal statute, for instance, in the waiver that the U.S. Department of Education granted last spring, it cites each line of their rule or code, and there are lines that are specific to delivering assessment, and then there's a variety of other requirements that are related to publishing and making determinations about those results. So, yeah, it's for a lot of us, it just seems like it's the same thing, but it's actually different. There are specific requirements to deliver assessments, which the federal government has indicated they're not planning on waiving, and then there are separate statutory requirements specific to reporting and making determinations or judgments about schools. In the federal arena, that's for a CSI and TSI schools that are separate in the requirements.
And so if we pass this second recommendation, would you not be CSI and TSI schools? Would you not report that, or would you report that anyway and move ahead? I'm a little muddled.
Yeah, it's not just you. It's a great time right now in terms of accountability. It's cloudy and it's smoky and hazy, and it's hard to see what's on the horizon. Last year, when the federal government granted waivers for accountability, they directed states, we had to sign an assurance that we would hold constant. So the schools that had previously been identified for CSI would maintain that designation, and those who had been identified for TSI would maintain that designation, and we wouldn't re-identify based on the spring of 20 because there were no assessment results. If the federal government were to grant waivers, again, this is part of the gray area board member canon because we don't know what that would look like. It might be that we have to come up with an alternative criteria to identify and also to exit student or schools from those designations. There might be a waiver. It's difficult for me to answer that question because there's so many unknowns. I compare it though to what you did with state accountability and turnaround as a board this last spring. Because we didn't have data, you still set some criteria that would allow those schools to demonstrate through alternative sources of evidence of whether they had met the expectations to exit the state turnaround. So in those cohort 2 schools and a couple of cohort 1 schools went through that process. So it's possible. I don't know if it's probable, but it's possible that type of a scenario could get set up. Obviously, we're dealing with much larger numbers in the CSI and certainly the TSI than what we were with state turnaround.
So Darren, if we pass this recommendation 2, tell me what the relief would look like. Because the recommendation is to relieve schools from federal and state accountability determinations. So tell me exactly what that means.
Okay, let's start with the easy one, or the easy side of that coin. We have state accountability. So that would trigger if the full board, if you as a committee and then the full board accepts that recommendation, then we know what the particular statutes are within state code related to accountability, and we would need to begin on behalf of the board working with the state legislature to when we talk about relief schools, I'm interpreting that is not award or not issue, have school accountability at the state level. There are several things related to accountability. You notice it doesn't just say school grades. There are a number of elements related to accountability that come into play, but we're signaling, if the board adopts this, they're signaling that we're not confident with the data that we're going to collect from, assuming we collect it still, which is unknown, but assuming we collect it, we're not comfortable with that data being used to make accountability determinations about schools. And staff then would need to begin working with the state legislature to come up with relief from that or waivers. In terms of the federal government, we would communicate with the U.S. Department of Education of the direction our board has given us, and then begin to work with them on what options we have. Again, this would not guarantee, this motion wouldn't guarantee that school accountability is not in play, because other authorities have some influence here, the state government and the federal government. It would just direct staff to try to seek relief from those accountability measures.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Janet, for all those great questions. And Darren, everything you say just helps me understand things more. Board Member Hanson, you have a question?
Yeah, just a couple of quick ones. One, do we have any indication what other states are doing at this stage? Have we heard anything from colleagues in other states?
We know that there's been a number of states. The last time I looked, four or five that have tried to get relief from actually administering assessments from the federal government. In terms of what they're doing with accountability, I assume if they're seeking waivers from assessment, then they automatically have to seek waivers from accountability. But that number of school or states is, again, relatively small. Most states have heard the message from the federal government. In terms of state accountability, I don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf of I don't know that I have enough data. I have opinions and I've heard things and I have read some things, but I don't have enough data to speak definitively on what other states are doing around accountability. I know from the calls that I've been on, the states that I've heard speak are in a similar position to what I'm representing to you today, and that is grave concerns about using assessment data for accountability, and anticipating that there'll be some type of movement towards either addendums, amendments, or waivers to accountability at the federal level. Again, that's based on my opinion, which comes from a small number of meetings that I've been in where other states have spoken to that topic.
And just a follow-up, if we approve this today and then it goes forward with the board, I think if we take all the pressure off ourselves as far as not trying to find a way to use the data we might be able to get for accountability, and then it's required in the end, we may end up, if we put all our efforts into trying to get that waived and then it doesn't happen, would that put us in a bad position, or is there a dual path that needs to be pursued here?
Yeah, so it's a great point. I don't know that it's applicable because there wouldn't be a waiver on the delivery of the assessment. So this motion wouldn't direct staff to seek waivers from delivering assessments this year. The board has been generous in allowing staff to have flexibility on the administration window for the Acadience assessment and also for the KEEP assessment, which for both those windows would have closed by now in a normal year. And you've allowed us to work with LEAs to be able to get as many students tested as possible, which I think sends a clear message to the field that we hope that they see value in the assessments that we provide through the State Board of Education, and that they'll make every effort to administer those assessments. Again, the circumstances are just incredible. The variations as we get input or feedback from various LEAs seeking, again, extensions on their testing windows, and we get to hear some of the details of their challenges. It's really incredible what some of our educators are facing in the state of Utah. But I don't believe there's been a message sent, or this would send a message to the LEAs that we don't expect testing to be, every effort to be taken to complete the testing.
Thank you, Darren. Scott, do you have a follow-up?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, committee, for your great questions and discussion. Do we have any other questions? If there are no other questions, we are looking for a motion either to accept recommendation number 2 or I suppose not to accept recommendation number 2. Is there somebody willing to make that motion or make a motion? Board Member Marsh.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the recommendation number 2 that the board take steps to relieve schools from federal and state accountability determinations based on the 2020-2021 assessments.
Okay, thank you. The motion before the committee is that we accept the APAC recommendation number 2, that the board take steps to relieve schools from federal and state accountability determinations based on the 2020-2021 assessments. Is there discussion to that motion? Board Member Earl, I can't tell your hand, it popped on and then it popped off. Any discussion to that motion? Seeing none, go ahead and vote. Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Committee, I just realized, and Darren, I want to ask you this too, in the first motion we made with recommendation number 1, we didn't include the year 2020, 2021. Is that something important for us to add?
That's a good question. Board Member Hanson earlier said words matter.
Yeah. I mean, not to put any pressure on you, but I just didn't know if that's something we should add in there. Board Member Marsh, do you have a comment on that?
Just a comment on that is that I don't think anybody here knows exactly how long this pandemic could go. So I don't think we need to tie ourselves to one specific year.
So if we leave the motion as is, if it needs to be addressed again, it can be addressed again. Darren, do you feel okay about that?
Yeah, that's a great point because we don't plan on using skip year growth. So again, it doesn't say not to use growth. It doesn't absolve staff from the requirement to use growth. It's just saying that this year our only option is skip year growth, and this motion directs, again, if approved by the full board, would direct us not to use that for accountability.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to bring that to make sure. Darren, thank you so much. Committee, thank you so much for all your great questions. And we are moving on to our next action item. So our next action item is R277-920, School Improvement Implementation of the School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act. And I have to tell you, committee, I'm sure you felt the same way, but I really appreciated the timeline to see that this is something that has had a lot of thought and discussion and so much work for nearly a year. Makes me realize how much detail and how much effort goes into just one thing. So just kind of to remind you, and I'm sure Darren could do a better job of this, but we began last November in the Standards and Assessment when staff first presented. And then if you remember, in February, it went before the full board and staff was asked to seek stakeholder input for exit criteria, which they did. And then from there, staff took the feedback and modeled possible approaches to exit criteria. And then today, they're going to share and propose turnaround exit criteria for us to consider. So committee, let's listen and let's hopefully end with some action because I know this is a time-sensitive issue and we need to come to a decision. So Darren, will you start off the discussion? Wait, or maybe is Angie going to start with just a general overview? I forgot about that.
Yeah, so I'll just, as Angie gets mic'd up.
Thank you.
As you look at this rule, you'll see lots of changes and lots of lines, and it looks like we've done a lot of stuff there. Angie's going to talk about just reformatting. So a lot of what you see in the rule itself has just been reorganized from previously existing sections. And then there were some changes recommended related to the funding flow to the LEAs that Max Lane, I believe, is going to talk about. The poem, though, that you shared, Chair Gravitt, at the beginning really resonates with this rule, now where it talked about one step at a time. This process has been a long journey. We're on a hike. But the amount of work that this committee has put into this particular substantive change that we're going to talk about today has been extensive, and I hope you recognize that as we begin talking about it shortly.
All right. Should I go ahead, Chair?
Yeah, Angie, thank you.
Great. And you both gave a good summary of the timeline, and I just as Darren stated and as you stated, Chair Gravitt, that this is essentially a culmination of a year's worth of work. And you'll all remember, because you were part of the committee, with the exception of maybe Board Member Earl, that back in November and December of last year and January of this year, you went through an exercise of identifying ways to allow schools to exit turnaround by creating a state review panel, et cetera. That will be part of what has been codified in this rule. Those discussions back in late 2019 and earlier this year led to staff working with the legislature to pass HB 420. That rule eliminated a number of criteria from the statute that were causing problems for us as staff as we had assessment system changes or other difficulties with different calculations. So thankfully, the legislature has now delegated the ability for you to establish exit criteria in board rule, which you will see in a moment, and Darren Nielsen and Ann Michelle Neal, who are our experts on that, will be going into detail after Max and I present the rest of the changes. And so, as you'll remember, as I stated the last time we met, so I'll move this here, and staff obtained feedback. The feedback went into this rule. But just as a reminder, this draft rule, most of it is not brand new language. Only the colored language are substantive changes. The rest is due to a reformatting of the rule that we undertook. And so I'm going to actually pull up the word perfect version, and or maybe I won't. I'll just stick with this version here of the rule. I like to have a word perfect version ready at all times so that if there are edits as we go, we're ready. So first, I just wanted to remind you that there's some defined terms. I'll kind of go through and highlight the big sections of the rule just to highlight the substantive changes. And then if you have questions for me or Max, let us know. And then I'll let you know the sections that Ann Michelle and Darren will touch on in more detail. So this definition of eligible school has been included in the rule because there was a repeal of a section of the code, 53E5307, relating to a program that now only applies to one of our schools who's still in turnaround. It only applies to schools who were identified based on the 2014-15 school year accountability. And so now that the statute is gone, it had the defined term in it, and you'll see later on those provisions are at the end of the rule, but that's what this defined term is. We also included a definition of state review panel, which is related to some of the work, again, that you all went through, or the decisions you made late last year, early this year, to have, for those years when we have assessment irregularities, to allow a state review panel to make determination of whether schools should exit turnaround. And so next I'll move on to line 132, which is where we're codifying the direction to the superintendent to not identify any low performing schools due to the accountability results from the 2019-20 school year. Again, that's because the state waived that requirement to administer assessments. Next, the next chunk of substantive changes begins on about line 276. Here you'll see some clarification about the prioritization of funding. We had some questions about what should be funded first. This clarifies that the funding that goes out to schools for their third-party providers is what is distributed first. If there's money left over, then the money left over can be used for the purposes in subsection 1. Next, the next chunk of substantive changes starts on line 364. And this is where you, for our school leaders, these are primary principals, they can receive incentive pay if they participate in leadership training, and also if they enter into an agreement with their school district or charter school to work at the school for 5 years or more. And in the past, we've had a hard time getting the submissions of the verifications of those agreements. So instead, what we're asking is, in lieu of submitting the actual agreement, we're asking the LEA to verify that the school leader entered into a written agreement. The next substance, this whole section 11, the exit criteria for low performing school, there's a lot of meat in here, and I'm going to defer and leave this section to Darren and Ann Michelle, as they are the experts on this section. But, and then also, you'll remember that we've now, so that if we have, hopefully we won't, but if we do have years where we have assessment irregularities, whether it's because of a change from one assessment system to another, or hopefully we won't have this situation happen this spring, but if we did have an assessment interruption due to COVID in part or all of our state, this now provides us with criteria that we can use in future years without having the board to kind of not make up, but come up with a way to allow schools to exit. And again, Darren and Michelle will speak more to that in a moment. And then the last substance that I'll just bring to your attention is, again, this last section 13 includes provisions related to a program that has now been repealed because it only applied to schools that were identified related to the 2014-15 school year. We do have one school left that could qualify for this, so we've left it in, but we've made technical changes as a result. And so I think I pretty much covered all of the changes except for those large assessment changes related to the exit criteria. I don't know if Max, if you have anything you wanted to supplement, I'd be happy to answer questions, or Chair, be happy for you to turn the time over to Darren to discuss the other portions. Oh, actually, before you do that, I apologize. Yesterday, I received a piece of feedback from the, apologize, I'm going to just turn off my video for a moment because I need to move my screen. I received a piece of feedback from the Superintendent's Association about language in this last section. If the committee would be okay with it, what they asked, is that in this section 13, in lieu of distributing the funding to a principal of a school and having the principal distribute funding to educators, they said that really has created a lot of problems with our LEAs and with the schools that receive this funding, because generally USBE does not distribute money directly to schools, and generally principals are not in charge of distributing funds. So I've made some what I would call technical changes, although they're meaningful changes that was requested by USSA representatives, to just have this program money distributed to the LEA, and have the LEA in consultation with the principal of the eligible school to distribute the money. And so if you are okay with those changes, maybe somebody could make a motion to adopt them. I've also created a draft 3 in preparation of potentially you approving those amendments, and then also I could use this draft 3 if there are other amendments that the committee wants to make, and then you as a committee could just adopt draft 3 at the end of today's meeting in lieu of doing individual motions, or we could kind of work on this draft 3 together. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Angie. I'm glad you caught that and made that draft. Committee members, let me just stop and see if you have any questions for Angie, since she kind of went over some things that some of you may have questions about. Board Member Earl? Well, it's weird, Jenny. Your hand just pops up like you're just waving, and then it goes away.
Sorry, up and down, up and down. It takes a minute for it to move, and by the time it does that, I figured it's not going to go on. So then I hit it again. So
no, that's okay. It's kind of exciting.
Yeah,
like you're giving me a high five.
I wish we had something different than this turnaround. It's so messy and it's so hard to understand all this. Anyways, I think I picked this up 4 or 5 times over the last little bit, and every time I do, I go and start reading the law, and then before long, I'm all, anyways. So I just have a few thoughts, a few comments, and maybe some questions.
Let me just stop and ask you: do they deal with what Angie talked about?
Are you talking what the
like the reformatting, the changing the LEA part, any of that? Because I want to make sure that Darren and Anne Michelle have a chance to talk to us, because they might answer some of our
questions. Well, maybe I had to wait then.
Okay, if that's okay. I just think some of the questions might be answered. Thank you. Then if there are no questions on Angie's portion, let me turn the time over to Darren and Anne Michelle. And if Max needs to, anybody who needs to step in, please step in and talk to us about the important things we need to know in order to make this important decision.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to have a short statement, and then if you could let Anne Michelle talk about these slides that she's prepared and get us to the real crux of the decision point that I see the committee making today. Back in February, on February 6th of 2020 is when the board made a motion to direct staff to seek legislative authority to amend the exit criteria. And then we were also directed to engage with stakeholders. APAC was specifically called out, but also schools that have been involved in the school turnaround program, and identify the threshold for exit criteria. And Anne Michelle has done a great job of preparing some slides to build that context, and then get to the point where we'll propose what that threshold is, make a proposal. And the real decision point, I think, for the board is that threshold meet the expectations of the board? And Michelle will be able to show you variations on that in if there are proposals of a different threshold to set. But Anne Michelle, would you like to take over?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Trying to start my video. Angie, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, there we go.
There you are.
So just as Angie did a nice job covering this timeline, and today we're going to review the stakeholder feedback that we were directed to collect in February of 2020, and how that informed the exit criteria that we are going to propose to you today. Go ahead, Angie. Next slide. Thank you. So for us, it was really important to consider what levers do we really have the ability to move or to change that could affect exit criteria. So we looked at the calculation method. Should exit be based on a single year or a multi-year average or consecutive years? The length of time schools need for implementation to be observable. Is it 3 years versus 4 years? We looked at criterion versus normative exit criteria, and we'll go into that more deeply as we continue. And then alignment across systems. For example, CSI. How can we make this more simple for LEAs and for schools so that turnaround and CSI and TSI don't all have these different rules and are very difficult to understand, and trying to hopefully create some alignment. Okay, next slide, please. So you can move on. So I'm just going to summarize the stakeholder feedback. We worked with, go back one, yep. With the PPRC, the Promise Partnership Regional Council, our APAC group, Title I directors, assessment directors, and we surveyed former turnaround school leaders to get an understanding of what priorities and principles we should take into consideration as we developed an exit criteria. Next slide. So in general, I do want to mention that you have a full summary of the stakeholder feedback in board backup related to each group we spoke with. But in general, the feedback was pretty consistent that there was a preference for criterion referenced exit goals that could create interim targets. Turnaround principles or former school turnaround principles very clearly stated that it needs to be reasonable enough to obtain, but also ambitious enough to motivate improvement. So it's that balance between rigorous yet achievable. And then again, adequate time for implementation, and that the system can be clearly communicated to stakeholders or parents or their communities. And also probably because we've been through many system changes and many assessment changes in the last while, that the exit criteria should be able to withstand changes in systems. So it's a broad summary of the stakeholder groups that we sought feedback for. Go ahead, Angie. So I just want to briefly review the difference between criterion reference and norm referenced. Go ahead, Angie, to the next slide. These are going to be quick. Norm referenced is improvement compared to the performance of others. So whenever we say something like the school needs to achieve above a certain percentage of all schools, that is a norm referenced exit criteria. Go to the next slide. So if we are trying to listen and really hear the feedback from stakeholders and create a criterion reference group, it's improvement toward a fixed target or goal that can be individualized to the school. And then those goals don't change over time, whereas a norm referenced exit criteria can change based on the performance of schools across the state. So a criterion referenced exit target was something we were really seeking to achieve. Go ahead, Angie. And again, this is a quick click that we found out that designing a true criterion referenced approach to exit is really challenging. Go ahead. Next. So we returned to some work that we completed in May of 2016 when we went through a standard setting process to set the thresholds for letter grades. So those were no longer norm referenced either. You have a supporting document in your backup that is called, I apologize, School Grades Cut Score Handout that shows what those cut scores were, but it was a process over 2 days. I think maybe 3. 2016 was a while ago, where we worked with several groups of stakeholders to set the thresholds for letter grades that would no longer be moving targets, and that was very well received and a great achievement in improving our accountability system. So we have these fixed targets, and that is something we could look to and rely on when we think about developing a criterion exit. Go ahead. I do want to note that even though since that standard setting, letter grade assignments have not been made in the school report card, but they were directly used to create the indicator level ratings that you see. And so even though the letter grade hasn't appeared on the school report card for several reasons and different reasons over time, that they are being applied in this way at the indicator level. Go ahead, Angie, to the next slide, please. So if we want to close the gap or focus on an exit target, closing the gap was our thought process, that designing an exit criteria to close the gap between where the school is when they are identified toward a fixed target respects really the input from stakeholders and also the timeline feedback that we received. They would have 4 years to implement. So year one would be their identification and planning year, and then they would have 4 years total to implement change. And at the end of that, we would look at their, if they met the target that was set. Okay, next slide, please. Another important thing for schools was predictable exit goals and interim targets. And the model we're going to present to you in a moment does this. This is an example of a tool that you can enter that baseline score and the parameters that we set for exiting, and that can create a very clear guideline for schools that they know exactly how much progress they need to make each year to reach that exit goal. Okay, please go on to the next one. So the model that we found to be truly in line with what the stakeholders were asking, and also I think really creates a true criterion reference exit, is closing the gap toward one of the letter grade thresholds. So we looked at how difficult is it for schools to get 50% to an A, or a third of the way to an A from their baseline, or 50% to a B, or 33% to a B, or 50% to a C. And then we also wanted to add assurances that the school would not be re-identified, that they would stay out of turnaround and CSI as well. Go to the next slide, please. So what we're proposing is a two-prong exit criteria that in the modeling, and the slide following this one will show you why this was chosen, but the criteria for exit is that schools close the gap from their baseline to the threshold for a B letter grade by 1/3. They make a 1/3 improvement toward the B letter grade. And then there's an assurance check that they achieve at least above the lowest performing 5% of schools. That keeps them above the lowest performing 3% of schools for turnaround, and also above the 5% threshold for CSI. Okay, next slide, please. So when we modeled with these different scenarios, working with the Center for Assessment, we found in our model, 23 schools hypothetically would be identified in the first year. The 50% to an A modeled that 4 schools would exit after 4 years. A third of the way to an A, 11 schools would exit after 4 years. 50% to a B was 9 schools. A third of the way to a B exited 14 schools. And 50% to a C exited 15 schools. Noticing that the 1/3 to a B versus halfway to a C is very similar. We felt like communicating that reaching the B threshold was more rigorous, but not much different. If we said it's okay for you to only achieve halfway to a C, that might send a different message. Next slide, please. So this is an expanded view of what I showed you before, modeling schools closing the gap between their baseline to the letter B, letter grade threshold by 1/3. It tells the school exactly how much their annual expected gain is, how many points they need to gain in the accountability system, and creates benchmarks along the way that they can check to see if they are on track for exiting turnaround. Okay. The next slide is just questions that you have about this model, or thoughts or suggestions, or anything you'd like to ask.
Oh, thank you so much, Anne Michelle. I have to tell you that if you put these slides together visually, they are so nice. And they help those of us who, no, it really helped me understand. I just appreciate all the work that's gone into that. So I'm hoping we can keep it to questions, first of all, and I would like the discussion to come after a motion's been made. So what questions do you have for Anne Michelle, committee members? Okay, Board Member Earl, go ahead.
All right, I'll try to weave into this a little bit. So I'm trying to understand. So the model that you had with how many getting to an A, B, C, that type of a thing, that was based on actual schools over the last several years. Maybe I missed that. What was that was based on? What was the criteria that we used?
That's a great question. We looked at schools' performance and accountability over, I think, starting in 2016, and modeled what their accountability score would have been in the current accountability system. And if we were to have a blank slate and identify schools based on the 2 consecutive year rule, which is currently how schools are identified for turnaround, that is where the estimate of 23 schools identified came from.
Okay, and is that consistent with how many schools we had exit, or would we? Do you know what I'm saying? I'm just curious. I'm trying to create a reference here. Or would it have been less exiting, more exiting?
It's a good question, and I might defer to Max, because the exit criteria has, and there was a slide about this, but the exit criteria has varied for every cohort, and been so, been adjusted and changed. And so it's hard to say that we can compare this proposed model to what actually occurred, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that leads to my question of what we have here, because our baseline would be the year that they were put in turnaround, right? That initial year. So because we've fluctuated on norm reference, now we're going to criterion reference, I'm wondering if that impacts the outcome because of that. Does that make sense? Because each year has fluctuated on that movement back and forth. So I'm wondering if that was taken into account.
We did not. I think what you're asking is, did we look at schools that were identified? And correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't just look at schools that were identified in prior years. We kind of started fresh with all the data we had available to us, and using the same identification that is currently in place of 2 consecutive years in the lowest 3%. We identified that 23 schools could be identified in our current system. So it's not reflective of the schools that were identified for turnaround, but more reflective of a hypothetical.
Right. And I guess my dialogue is relevant to moving forward, right? Because now they're going to use the baseline year, and with it those numbers fluctuating from year to year. I just wondered, I hope that statistic doesn't throw things off somewhere where each year was different, and then we're using a criterion referenced now where we weren't before. Anyways, just a thought. I hope we'll kind of keep that in mind as we're moving forward, so we don't have some statistical issues with that.
Go ahead, Anne Michelle.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I'm fine. Go ahead.
Okay, Board Member Hanson.
Thanks. So first, if I understand right, since we've gone to a criterion-based exit criteria is criterion-based, that means it would be subjective based on the committee. Is that right? That they would assess the growth based on the goals of the school during the turnaround?
I want to say no, because we do have the criteria to exit is that they close the gap by 33%. So it can be statistically calculated, it can be forward projected to set those goals and interim targets, and they would know exactly what their exit would be individualized to each school. So that's, to me, not subjectivity, it's more individualization. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. So, but to get to a B, we would decide what needed to happen for them to get to a B. The committee would do that, or is there going to be strict criterion for A, B, C, D?
We have not specified that in the rule. That would be, the school would know what improvement they needed to make, and they could use their school report card or other data to create their school improvement plans in order to achieve that goal. And the school improvement plan sets the goals for, and I have to defer to Max and Leslie on this, but around leadership development and staff training, and perhaps they learn they need to focus with a specific student group. So that would be defined in the school improvement plan for a turnaround school. This just sets for them the target that they need to meet and the interim goals that they can monitor along the way.
So if I understand right, so at the beginning of the turnaround process, so somehow we decide these schools need to be in turnaround. The committee sits down with the school and says, these are the goals that we are setting for you to get to A, B, C, D. And then they would have to achieve the 33% of the way to a B or something based on those goals, but they'd be individual for each school. Is that right? Or would we have an overall set of criteria that we'd expect all schools to achieve?
The projections for closing the gap by 33% would be individualized to the school based on where they started. If they were in the bottom 1%, they might have to grow more. If they were just below the 3% threshold then identified, then their expected growth might be less annually. And yes, our turnaround team and our Center for School Improvement would sit down with schools and say, okay, this is what is expected for you to exit turnaround status within 4 years. And all of the supports that the Center for School Improvement can provide supports that growth toward closing that gap. Does that make sense?
I probably just missed this in the presentation, but my question is pretty basic. Is there a set criterion? Can we evaluate any school and determine whether they were at A level, B level, C level, D level? Is that so? We'd have set criterion, and every school would have some sort of a letter grade. We could assign a letter grade to each school.
Yes, that is true. Yes, and if you refer to the document in backup that I mentioned, I'm trying to find it. It's called School Grades Cut Scores, and that tells you the cut score thresholds for elementary and high schools for an A school, B schools, C, etc. We're looking to get schools a third of the way closer to the B threshold.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please, Darren.
I think I understand your question and some of the confusion. I might not have it all, but we've indicated earlier that we haven't published letter grades, even though statute, or we created this criterion reference to grading system for schools. We haven't published those. On the back end, behind the scenes, we still calculate those in order to determine or at least the points associated with those grades. We calculate those to determine who qualifies in the lowest 3% and 5% and so forth. So, Angie, if you'll scroll up 5 slides, back up from where we are now, go up 5. Yeah, right there. Up 1, right there, right on that one. So let's take, so for example, we have cohort 4 schools that were identified for state turnaround that still don't know their exit criteria. They've come into the system while we've been working through this process. We got legislative change, and now we're trying to put some criterion into the board rules. So they will be able to know what their exit criteria is, whereas right now they don't know. If you were to pass this, and I think, Michelle, this model right here is the proposed 33% to a B, and let's say the school got 49.69% of 49.69 points, and that's what qualified them to be in cohort 4. Although all of the schools in cohort 4 will have different point totals, it's very unlikely they would all have the same point totals. But let's say one of them is this point total. If you were to pass this rule with the language that it has right now, once the full board passed it, those schools could sit down and say, oh, my target is 63.75 points 4 years from now. And then when they work with their team that comes in to help them, they know what the target is, and they could set these intermediate targets in the years prior to their exit date and monitor that. The points that they can earn come from different indicators, and so that would be individualized. They would determine within their own school what area are they the lowest performing, or what do they want to target, what's their greatest area of need through their root cause analysis. But the significant change would be if you approve this recommendation is now they would know what their exit criteria is 4 years from now, whereas previously it was a norm reference, and so they wouldn't have been able to tell you how many points they need to be able to exit the turnaround. So that's a significant change from what we have had before.
I appreciate that, and I understand that this would give them a target that wouldn't move, that they could go forward. My question, though, is still, I'm back on the chart that shows the cut scores, and so it says, A is exemplary, B is commendable. So this is like a teacher grading the school, or grade, right? So we're going to give them a letter grade. I'm just wondering how concrete or how subjective those scores are, and who's going to give them those scores. So what is the criteria for coming up with whether they've achieved a 94.88 in a certain area? I guess this is overall, though, right? The school's going to have one grade for the whole school, not a grade for each aspect of education there.
Yeah.
Angie, will you scroll up 2 slides, please? Right there. Yeah. So these are the indicators, and remember, Hanson, your question, I think it's in state statute, the points. So of that example you gave with the number of points, 94.88 to get to an A, there is in state statute, it's clearly defined how many points you get for achievement, how they earn points for achievement, for growth, for post-secondary readiness. Those criteria around calculating those points is clearly defined, and I believe it's in state statute.
Yes.
Okay, so we are going back to use the grading criteria that was in statute from before to assign these grades. We're not recreating that. That's the basic question. All right, thank you. The next question that I have is in the slides, and maybe we can get to the right one. It shows the number of schools that you projected would exit. Oh, and I'm in the wrong portion of this now. Let's see there. Yeah, that one. So we're right now turnaround is 3 years, and we're extending to 4. And so after that additional year, we're saying that of the 23 schools that are in, only 14 would be able to exit. So we're anticipating that 9 of them would take more than 4 years to do the improvement. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. That those, and again, this is a hypothetical model. It is just modeling, but it does give us a sense of ratio of schools that would exit. So the schools that did not exit would then be eligible for extension, and that's also part of the rule. The criteria that schools would need to be eligible for an extension.
So if effectively then we're for a third at least, maybe more of the schools, we're extending this turnaround not to just 4 years, but we're extending it to 5 or 6 years probably. It would
potentially, yes. So, and this may be an opinion, but my belief is that when you give clear targets, Angie, if you can go to the next slide, if you give a school clear targets and help them see that they just need to make an annual expected gain of 3% or 4.5 points each year that they will exit, that schools can meet that goal. It's when the goal is unpredictable that that schools flounder. And so I think that this is a way for schools to know what they need to achieve and work toward that achievement. And can you go up 2 slides, Angie? In the decision for 33% growth toward the B letter grade, that makes the criteria the true driver of the exit. If you said, we played around a lot with these different thresholds, and this assurance of 5%, should we make that 8%? And when we hit about 8%, then the norm referenced piece becomes the driver for exit. But keeping it at 5% makes the criterion portion the driver, if that makes sense. And it could, and we presented the data on the next slide for your consideration if you wanted to increase that rigor to 50% to a B, or a third of the way to an A. That those are things for this committee to consider and make a recommendation on.
I just want to step in for just a second. I just want to remind our committee on the time, and I want to check because we have a couple of items that we really need to move. So I want to see committee members. Does anyone need to leave at 6 o'clock? Or can committee members stay? Please let me know if you cannot stay past 6 o'clock, please let me know now, because we need committee members for voting.
This is Board Member Earl. I've got to go about 15 minutes after 6.
Okay, so you have till 6:15. Is there anybody else who cannot stay?
That's about my limit tonight as well.
Yeah, okay. Board Member Cannon, I have family coming.
So one of the things I want to say, I just want to comment on what Anne Michelle was saying, and I have to tell you from an educator's perspective, educators and the education community is really good at hitting a target that doesn't move. The thing that's been frustrating with turnaround for me, from my perspective, and from the educators I reach out to, is we don't know when it changes. Some years we would be that, it's frustrating not to know what we're aiming for. And so I really appreciate this criterion reference that my success as a school isn't dependent on somebody else's success. And so I wanted to throw that out there because I think that's a really positive direction. And then the other thing I want to say to the committee is, I don't know where people are feeling for sure on making a motion, but just because of time constraints, it might be good for us to make a motion and see if we can go from there, because we have essentially 45 minutes and we have to get this one done. And we also need to do the trafficking one. I mean, the others we can push off, but that's what we need to do. So just wanted to throw that out there to committee so that you know what we need to accomplish in 45 minutes. So thanks for letting me interrupt.
Could I just ask what the time constraints are on this particular item if we were to bring it back?
Yeah, Darren, I know that, Darren, will you talk to that? Because I think we have, like, December is like the final. We've got to get it to full board, etc. So Darren, will you comment on that?
Well, and I'm actually going to defer to Angie because I think it has to do with filing a rule in the Office of Administrative Rules is the pressure point. Obviously, our cohort 4 schools have been in limbo for a while, and so they another month probably isn't a significant difference for them. But Angie, is it correct that there was some pressure as far as filing something with the Office of Administrative Rules?
Well, legally, we're supposed to file updated rules based on legislation within 180 days of the bill being enacted. But there are times when, and it's often due to board discussion of certain rules, like the bullying rule is an example, that the recent special ed update rule is another example, where we have been late and then we just explain why we haven't filed it on time. So normally, to be on track, the board would need to have approved this rule in November, but we've often had the final versions approved in December, and the Administrative Rules Committee has not, been upset or anything. So there is some urgency for to meet that expectation, but also for the field. But I think if it's much better to have good policy than to rush it. So it's up to the committee. If you need to postpone this and bring it back in November, we can do that. I can explain to the Rules Committee, and we'll be okay.
So I'm thinking.
Can I ask a question about this?
Yeah, Janet.
I had a note because it was on our agenda for last time, and my note said that the motion would be to continue, amend and continue this. Do we need to continue this as well as just approve draft 3?
The continuation, I don't believe, is time sensitive. I think it's just a combination because it hasn't been continued for a while. It's probably up for continuation like within the next year. So, no, to my knowledge, we're not under a rush to get it continued.
So we don't need that as part of our motion.
No, we do want it as part of the motion. Although we did change our policy recently to say that anytime that a rule is amended, we'll also assume or imply that the board supports continuation. So we are going to be doing both. Once this amendment gets passed, we will also file a continuation at the same time. But it's not, that part's not time sensitive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Board Member Earl, you have a question?
Yes, I had several. Now I should have wrote a few more of them down because I was just thinking while we were going. I would recommend we got a little bit more detail on this. So at a certain point, maybe we need to move on to the other items and continue with this over the next month. There's quite a few items that I have questions about. I do have my question I have right here though is how many schools do we have still in cohort 1 and 2 that may be impacted this year by whatever we make changes from, or will they not be impacted until 2 years down the road, or others? I'm just curious on that.
Would that be a question for Darren or Anne Michelle?
I think I can answer that question, but I'm going to ask Max or Leslie to correct me, or Leah if I'm wrong. I think there's one school still remaining in cohort 1 in extension, and one school in cohort 2. This is criteria intended to be applied to cohort 4 and beyond. With the design intention for it to be, able to withstand system changes.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. I was wondering if those that have, within a couple of them that are still within this time frame or within this year should be at the end of the year coming out, or could, I guess. I just wondered how that impacted them. So that answered one of those questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to do, just for the sake of time, and if it doesn't work and we need to bring it back next month, it seems like really the thing that we need is they're just questions that committee members have and discussion. And that could be something that we could have, even if we needed a mini workshop, we could talk about those things and then come back ready to go, ready to make that decision. But just because I want to see where committee members are, because I know where I am on this, and so I want to just see if we have the vote. So I'm going to make a motion that the committee approve R277920 draft 3 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Cannon?
I have several questions, so I'm not ready to vote aye yet. So my hand is there for asking questions.
Okay, well, since we're in the discussion, if there are any questions, I think what we'll do is maybe discuss for a maximum 10 more minutes, and then we're going to call it. And then if it looks like committee is not ready to make that vote, then we'll just maybe do a mini workshop. We'll come prepared next month, if that's okay. So Janet, go ahead and ask a question.
All right. As I was going through this particular rule, I noted that there are definitions and a lot of information on critical needs schools, and specifically the critical needs schools are identified every 3 years. And I understand critical needs school is a federal designation and that they get federal money. Am I correct in that?
Does somebody want to address Board Member Cannon's question?
I believe that's true of critical needs schools and targeted needs schools.
Yes, I think that probably Max or Leslie would probably be the best ones to answer that, but yes, they are federal.
Okay, so the critical needs schools, it says they're identified every 3 years on lines 90 to 95. And then the targeted needs status refers to student groups of 10 or more, and these are identified every year, annually. But then there isn't a definition or there isn't an identification piece for a turnaround school in this rule that I saw, other than on line 273, it says the variability in the number of schools identified annually for turnaround, it varies. So I'm assuming then that the turnaround schools are being identified annually. So my question goes to how often are those schools identified, particularly the turnaround schools?
Chair Gravitt, either Max or Rebecca Donaldson can answer that question.
Okay, thank you. Max or Rebecca?
This is Max Lang. Good afternoon. Education specialist, school improvement for the board. So actually, if you, in this particular rule, if you scroll up under definitions to section 2, which is like line 43, it's the wording is low performing school. So low performing school specifically speaks to schools in turnaround. Then when you go down to section 3, just the next page down, section 3 defines critical needs schools. Next page, critical needs schools as those schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement under ESSA. And then later on, it talks about those schools for targeted support and improvement for specific student groups. So the way it's defined is school turnaround is specific to turnaround, or low performing is specific to turnaround. Critical needs status is more directed towards those schools identified for school improvement under ESSA, federal.
And so then how often are turnaround schools identified? What schedule are they on?
They're identified every year.
Okay.
The exception of 2020-21. Then the CSI schools are identified. So that is Title I schools, low performing Title I schools, and schools with low graduation rate are identified every 3 years. The targeted support and improvement schools for student groups are identified every year.
Thank you. I've needed clarity on that. I appreciate your letting me know that. And then the turnaround designation is a state designation, correct? And the other two are federal.
Correct.
Okay. So is there, what happens if you have a low performing school that also is a critical needs school? How do you divvy those out?
So if a school is identified for state school turnaround, so low performing school, they won't again be identified for CSI status under ESSA. They'll just continue with the process for state school turnaround.
Okay.
It's virtually the same, meaning they have a needs assessment, they develop a plan that the board approves. Those larger umbrella requirements are applicable to both. But
okay. Then are the low performing schools defined as those in the lowest 5% of all schools, where critical needs are the lowest 5% of just Title I schools?
So under the rule, the way it's written, low performing is describing those schools for state school turnaround. And those are the schools that are in the lowest 3% for 2 consecutive years.
Okay, thank you.
Their critical needs status are Title I schools, 5%, and graduation rate, 67% for 3 years on average.
Thank you. I understand that much better now. And then I did have another follow-up question. Let me see if I can find the line that I wrote it down on. One of them, somewhere it talks about oh yeah, here it is, line 301. What is the status of the independent school turnaround experts? In some place in this rule, I saw that they didn't need to utilize one. I think that was in the CSI schools on line 99. And then down on line 301, it says they do need to contract with an independent school turnaround expert. So can you sort that out a bit for me?
Sure. So a requirement for schools in state school turnaround is that they select from one of the USB approved turnaround expert provider lists a turnaround expert provider and contract with that provider to create a plan, a school turnaround plan, and implement that plan. That's only required for state school turnaround. That requirement does not extend to schools identified for CSI under ESSA.
Okay. Thank you. Those were my questions. I appreciate your giving me the time to ask.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question. Board Member Earl.
Okay, I took my hand off instead of my volume, so sorry about that. My question has to do with if you have a school, so you modeled a school that could make that 3% increase over the course of the 4 years. Are they committed to the 4 years once they start? In other words, if within 2 years they meet that 33% B range, is there a way to exit at that point?
Yes. Not at 2 years, but we did write into the rule that schools could exit if they met that exit criteria in year 3 and up to year 4. So they could exit after year 3 or up to 4 years. And that matches what is in our ESSA consolidated plan for comprehensive for CSI schools, that they can exit in the 3rd or 4th year.
Okay, and then with that, if a school within that 4 years meets that criteria, but let's say 1 year they're up higher, and then the next 2 years they're down a few points below, what does that look like?
You mean after they exit, or
no? Let's say it's
while they're in
year 2, 3. Maybe 2 they're above. Year 3 and 4 they're below the threshold. So
the current exit criteria. This is a really good question. The current exit criteria is defined as it's what gets you in, gets you out. So if 2 consecutive years below 3%, you have to be 2 consecutive years above 3% to exit. If you don't make that in the 2nd year, you already know you're not going to exit. So it's sort of like, the jig is up a little bit. And so in this change to the rule, we are looking at only the final year to be above, to make that 1/3 gain toward the B letter grade and be above the 5% threshold, so that schools have a chance to implement, even if they might fluctuate up and down while they are in turnaround. We look at the final year. That is a change.
Okay, so it's just that final year that will end up counting. So even if they've made significant progress and maybe they had a year that was, for whatever reason, then that they would stay within turnaround then.
Well, say like year 2, they had a real
consecutive then. Okay,
a
so
real
sorry, I misunderstood at the end of that.
They could recover from that
last year. So I apologize. It sounded like the last year.
Okay, so committee, I have a thought here, and I'm going to do a substitute motion. And Angie, I'm going to need your help because you are master motion maker. I think with all of the great, oh, look, it just magically happened. I think with all of the great questions you guys have, with all of the thought, this is so much to take in. And I think we're going to have similar questions from the entire board. And so I'd like to make a substitute motion that the board hold a special session or board meeting to discuss R277920 prior to the board's regular November meeting. Is there any discussion to that motion?
Board Member Cannon, I'll just say my questions were answered and I now feel good about this. I'm ready to vote.
Okay, so any other discussion to the motion? I see Board Member Earls thinks it's a good idea. I'm not seeing any other discussion, so let me restate the motion. The motion is that the committee requests that the board hold a special session or board meeting to discuss R277920 prior to the board's regular November meeting. Committee members, go ahead and vote now. Okay, let's see. Do I see Mark Marsh? There he is, he's down there. Okay, that motion carries unanimously. So we will be having a special session. I guess you'll let us know, whoever is in charge of making that magic happen. And thank you so much, and Michelle and Darren and Max and Tracy and Leslie, who are on there somewhere, and just everybody who's been a part of this. And then we will continue from there.
Eric Rabbit.
Yeah.
Just one more thing. If we could have any board members submit questions that they still had prior to that meeting, that would be amazing. Then we can have everything ready and prepared.
Thank you. Yes, what Patty said. If committee members, you have questions, concerns, let's just get them to, who would be the best person to direct them to, Patty?
Darren, would you say yourself or Anne Michelle?
Yeah, I'm happy to receive those questions. I'm sure I'll enlist help in answering those, but why don't you direct those to me?
Darren's the lucky guy.
And Chair Gravitt, if any board members have amendments that they'd like prepared, I would also be happy to prepare. And maybe Darren, as he's fielding the questions, he might be able to identify which ones might be something in board rule where we could prepare an amendment in advance. I'd be happy to do that as well.
Okay, so committee members especially, I feel like we need to take the lead on this. If there are additional motions that you want to make, check with Angie. She can help write those. In fact, you just think it and they appear on the screen. It's kind of magical. So thank you, everyone. I think committee, what we will do, it looks like we have about, well, just a little over 15 minutes we're going to skip to the implementation for human trafficking. If we can get done with that and enough board members can stay, it would be great if we could at least have some discussion on the mental health screener. If we can't, we'll have to push that to next month. So let's move to action item number, I think it's number 6. And it's instructional materials for implementation of human trafficking prevention and awareness requirements for youth. And just a reminder to committee members, I know you know this, but we got into a great discussion last time, but it's important to remember that vendors will be responding to these minimum expectations, and it's not what teachers will be using. We talked a lot about definitions last time, and we'll be using, it's good to know that we use code for definitions. And again, this is another item that has been months in preparation, and Corby, I know, has just worked hard on this and taken your suggestions and taken your questions. And so, Corby, will you talk to us about some of the changes or information you have as a result of our discussion last month, and then we'll see if we can get this passed.
Awesome. My name is Corby Eason, educational specialist in student supports. So here today, I'll bring back the minimum expectation for human trafficking prevention and awareness training for youth. Again, just to frame this conversation, potential providers will be responding and will be using this document, and this is not going to teachers. So just be very aware of that, and just have that in the back of your mind. And so real quick, Jeff, if you can scroll to the other document, I made a quick outline of what was changed. So real quick, what was changed, we reformatted the document. We put it in an outline style. We added new headers. One of the headers is recognizing warning signs, identifying children who are victims and are at risk of becoming a victim of human trafficking. Human trafficking prevention, that's another header. Responding to a disclosure, that's another header, and reporting. And so those are 4 headers that were added to reformat the document. Another change would be we deleted language in the intended purpose section. Remove the language of it being a guide for evaluation. We just want to make it clear that this is for potential providers to see the minimum concepts that need to be in their training. Also, going next to the human trafficking section, we added examples of labor trafficking, and this is number 1. In section A, with its first define human trafficking. That's based off the definition that is in code. We just provided examples. I know there was a bit conversation in last meeting, so we decided to add examples to help clarify based off the code that align with the code. And I worked with AAG Michelle Buse and Brian Quincyberry to get those examples. We discussed it with myself, Leah Voorhees, and Brian Olmstead. We had a conversation and we all agreed upon those are some good examples. Next update to the adult behavior section, we deleted the narrative of labor trafficking and just replaced it with the same definition that you see in the beginning section of the human trafficking section. Again, that's language that is defined in statute and code. And so that's another change that was made towards the document. And finally, we added age-appropriate scaffold curriculum language in the appropriate use of technology section, the appropriate adult behavior section, and recognized general warning sign section of the document. So anywhere that said curriculum, we added age-appropriate scaffold curriculum. I know that was a big part of the conversation. And so those are the changes that were made based off the board member feedback and the committee feedback last month.
Oh, thank you for that overview. That's a lot of work. Are you ready for questions, Corby?
Sure.
Okay, you're like, of course. Committee members, what questions do you have for Corby? Start us off, Board Member Hanson.
I appreciate the work that Corby and the team did on this. I read through it, and I'm ready to make a motion that we approve this and move it on to the board.
Okay, so the motion before the committee is that the Standards and Assessment Committee forward a recommendation to the board for approval of the minimum expectations for human trafficking awareness and prevention instruction materials for youth. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Hanson, your hand's still up, but I'm assuming that's not for discussion. Okay, magic. Okay, then committee members, go ahead and vote now. Okay, that motion carries unanimously. Corby, yay, good work. Good work, committee. That was a little anticlimactic. Okay, since I have committee members still here for maybe another 13 minutes, can we just hop on over to the mental health screener? And I would really love for Christy to talk to us. And if we don't get to the motion, we don't get to it. But I think there are some important things she would need to say to us for us to consider, and maybe some input for her, especially when it comes to, in the background, the second paragraph about the difference between DUSAMA legal counsel and USB legal counsel. I think that's the issue that we need to discuss. But Christy, I'm going to let you talk us through this.
All right, great. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks for hanging in there. Fun Friday night.
That's right. So what we have found with this particular board rule, R277625, is it's really been a matter of definitions. So it's kind of like my daughters and I were talking, and we were talking about fish and chips. And in Britain, chips are fries. Yeah. But in America, chips are potato chips. And so we're kind of finding some of the same nuances in mental health. And when we started looking at the core issues around, why is it that one thing, maybe behavioral health isn't mental health, or mental health screeners can't include behavioral health. Why do we keep it? It almost feels like we're talking in circles, but that's because definitions haven't been established. And so this document was created with DUSAMA. So I've got Scott Eyre here with us as well to answer questions. So this is something we would like to provide for you as a foundation of the rest of these conversations. And so a couple of things have been established. One, out of committee last month, there was concern about the definition of participating LEA. And what we have found is a participating LEA, by definition, is an LEA who is choosing to conduct a mental health screening. And so the program itself, or participating LEA, that's not necessarily specific to the funding that's attached to it. It's attached to the activity of conducting mental health screening. And so that, you can see it's later on down in that document, that's been established. Also, a couple of things that I'd like to point out is We believe that because there is not an established meaning of mental health, that makes it very difficult to establish what a mental health screening is. And so as you can see with mental health, that is defined as something that affects how we think, feel, and act. So thereby, behavior, student behavior, that's a little further down on this front page, would be included within mental health overall. And within statute, the definition of screeners, as well as the definition of mental health, that was left basically up to the board and the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health to establish that. And as we started looking for definitions, what we found is there's not currently anything in rule or statute on either side for the state board or for DSAMA that clarifies and provides these definitions. And so that in and of itself really does speak to how new this territory is for all of us. And so as you get further down in this document, I won't go through each of the definitions, but I'll tell you each of them are there for a purpose to establish alignment between USBE and DSAMA, as well as mental health, clinical mental health, and school-based mental health. And so as you get to behavior, you'll notice that it's just defined as an observable or measurable act. And with act also being included in the description or the definition of mental health, behavior is thereby a part, it's a subset of mental health. And so as part of that, so you can see this kind of comes in multiple layers. When we talk about mental health screening and what are we screening for, I think we really do need to be clear on what exactly the mental health screening would entail. And so if we're going to move the direction of excluding any sort of factor that would contribute or give an indicator of mental health, we need to be very clear on that. We need to specifically call it out. So maybe I'll pause at this point, Chair, and open for questions.
Yes, I have them hostage until 6:15. So are there any questions, committee? Okay. Board Member Earl, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So I guess, and the concerns have arisen because the bill came about as a grant program initially, and then it ended up kind of morphing into more of a overall mental health bill originally. So I think that's where some of the concerns or questions came from, was wondering, is this associated participant? Is it with the grant element otherwise? So I'm grateful for the clarification, just because that was dialogue I've had with a number of people, is that uncertainty about, is this what this really is? Because it may not have come that or understood that from the first part of the legislative session, but it morphed into something a little different than it had started out with.
Okay. Thank you, Board Member Earl. Board Member Cannon, go ahead.
Thank you. As I was reading this, it made me wonder how much money is devoted to this. It talks a lot about financial aid for qualifying parents and so forth. What kind of money are we talking?
Board, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Chair Gravitt, thank you. So we have $500,000, $500,000 for this whole program. And the division of that, how much is for the actual screener versus how much is to be distributed to parents who need to seek services outside the school, that's yet to be determined.
Okay, thank you. Then my other question was, they talk about having training, and they say that the LEA administrator must attend the training. And I'm just wondering about those using the screening, or why did they choose the LEA administrator? Because it seems to me like they're a little farther away from the problem. So would you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so the training in and of itself, it wouldn't be specific to individual screening tools. So the training would be specific to what a delivery system should look like, all of the components that need to be in place in a school in order to effectively utilize the mental health screener. And so because there are several screening tools, the individuals conducting that tool, we would hope that they either have the previous training to conduct those tools or seek out the training through the creator of the tool.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Janet. Thank you, Christy, for those answers. Is there anybody else who have questions or perhaps a motion?
Chair, I would make a motion that the committee approve R277-622 Draft 1 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
Just, I think it's 625. I just want to make sure, right?
Oh, I have it correct in one line and I read the wrong line.
Hey, I just didn't know if you had inside information. The motion before the committee is that the committee approve R277-625 Draft 1 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Earl?
Yeah, I have one more maybe clarifying question. So screeners that, and I know you've kind of addressed it here, but screeners that a school administers, that a teacher does like an observation, right? And I think it was addressed here. So the legal ruling on that is that it is a mental health screener, right? And they need to get parent consent. I'm just making sure that's accurate, just because I previously got mixed information on that. Is that coming from our legal team?
Christy, will you respond to that, please?
Yes, absolutely. So later down in the document, there is a point of discussion that we would also need to clarify time provided today. So as you can see, when we get down to behavior observations and checklists, there is a little bit of differing opinions from legal counsel. So the USBE AAG feedback was that whether it's a tool or a program, it still is defined as a mental health screener because ultimately the intent would be for the student to reveal information about their mental health. However, on the other side of that, DSAMA AAG said that because the behavioral health screeners that they're referring to do not necessarily have the student actively participate, it is by observation. So it falls under that category of more behavior related, which kind of circles back to our mental health definition and where we're at there. And so they're saying because it falls in that category, it does not necessarily qualify as a mental health screener. And so as you can see, that's something that we would need to kind of hash out here in order to move forward with what should and shouldn't be on the mental health screening tools list.
Okay. So this is important because there's a lot of people are using these and they're making assessments about kids or recommendations based on what they're seeing. So I'm wondering, so is it based on what we put into action, or what are we waiting for on that? What do we need to make a decision?
It is recommended that the board make this determination because the way it can be interpreted because of the way the statute was written, we would need to ultimately decide if the behavior checklist thereby need to be included under that mental health screener definition, or if it needs to be separate, and thereby we create separate standards or expectations for those. That because of the ambiguity, that is something that we would like the board to decide.
I would err on the side of a mental health screener because it's used for that intent to reveal information about a student.
So to clarify, Jenny, you agree with the USBE AAG's feedback?
Yes, I do.
Hey,
yes,
I do too. I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page.
Can I clarify a little bit about our feedback? I'll just interrupt here for 15 seconds.
Go ahead. Yeah, thanks.
Initially, I had concluded that it was a mental health screener and thus shared that opinion. Michelle Buse was able to actually find the screener, look at it, and determine that it was more behavioral than mental. And I didn't have the benefit of that when I shared my opinion. And then the other assistant AGs from the other agency weighed in and also felt that it was more behavioral, less mental health. And thus, so when you're talking about our AAG opinion, I would go with what Michelle has researched and determined, because she was, like I said, able to actually look at the screener where I wasn't. So I think that's where we're at right now. I just want to clarify that piece of discussion.
So Brian, does that make yours more in line with what Dusama said?
Yes, Michelle and I are in line with what Dusama said.
So we almost need to just take out letter B, because that's no longer the opinion of AAG.
Yeah, I'm just reading that right now. Christy, I think you drafted, does that sound correct? Let's see. Yes.
Christy, how are they using this? When they get the data, how are they using the information?
Many of the LEAs that we've spoken to that are using the behavior screeners are using them as indicators. So they are using them to kind of determine next steps or possible interventions. It would look a little different than if you were looking at like the Columbia rating scale for suicide, in which that targets a more specific mental health condition. And so there is a difference, and there is a difference in the way they operate in the educational setting. And so, Chair, if I may, Brian, it sounds like the AAGs really are in alignment as far as the behavior.
Yes, and I just put in the chat box. Yep, and I just put in the chat box, you can delete paragraph B, 3B. That was my old former opinion.
That was your old self. I know that some people need to leave, but as long as you're there, I want to address Board Member Hanson's question and remind us that we do have a motion on the table. So, Board Member Hanson.
Yeah, I do think we're going to need some more discussion on this. I'm looking at our definition of behavioral health. And these behavior screeners, I assume, are assessing behaviors, and behavioral health says substance abuse and mental health services. So I think we're kind of all wrapped up there when we're doing a behavior screening. I also wonder what happens to the records from these behavior screeners, and if they're treated as part of the student's records and subject to the same restrictions that would be in here, and if not, why shouldn't they be? I guess so. I share some concerns with us treading too fine of a line when we're doing these passive screenings and then not calling that a mental health screener. And certainly be interested in any feedback on that point of view.
Christy, is there anything you want to respond to Board Member Hanson's concern?
I would actually like to refer to Jeff for this one. I noticed he also has some other input for us.
Okay, Jeff, yeah, please.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, so the feedback I just wanted to give relates directly to that question very quickly. So this feedback comes from Cindy Phillips from the Charter School Association. As you recall, she had the comment last month about what is a participating LEA, and now she also has some comments regarding what is and is not a mental health screener. Her example she uses is in her charter school, they have teachers trained to observe learning behaviors of students.
Jeff, you just went away. Jeffrey Van Holten, are you still there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back.
Okay.
I had to use your full name to get you back.
That just like my mother.
No, you can call me Mom.
Essentially, her LEA, her charter school uses, they train teachers to observe learning behavior of students. And then from those passive observations, they implement behavior interventions to help with learning outcomes. So one of the big questions she had is, why would I need to go through a process outlined in this board rule to get that approved when it was created by the charter school? It's a best practice situation that they have trained their teachers on. So to sit and get like a whole list of, evidence-based data and all of that would be difficult, and to go through this process when she feels it is not a mental health screener to begin with. So that's kind of one of those things that falls in, do we want to count something like that as a screener or not? Because it does observe behavior. There's a question of whether or not it observes for the sake of a mental health condition, which she would argue it does not. However, if a teacher does...
You just disappeared, Jeff. But maybe you can't hear me because you disappeared.
For waiting for him to come back, I think that if we're going to carve that out, it needs to be a specific carve out here, that we need to say behavioral screeners that only do this and this are not included in as mental health screeners. Because I can see teachers doing that observation and then saying, this child looks like he's at higher risk for suicide or something like that. And then we start to really get over the line. So my thoughts.
Okay, no, those are good thoughts. I know we have several people who need to leave, and I want to honor that. So I think what we'll do is, since there is a motion on the table, unless somebody wants to make an alternate motion, we'll just vote on that motion. And if it doesn't pass, then we will be bringing it back. I think, Christy, you just wanted to hear some of the discussion. And so if we need to bring it back, we can do that. But let me just remind you.
Chair?
Yeah.
This is Board Member Cannon.
Yeah.
I would like to withdraw my motion.
Okay.
And could I make a motion that we table this until the special meeting? Would it be appropriate to add this as a second item for the special meeting?
Well, that's a great idea. Somebody who is in the world out there in my computer, could you tell me if that's something we can do? I think that's a great idea, but Patty?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for direction on too. Of course, we can always make that request.
Okay.
Since this one isn't time sensitive, I don't think we could add it to next month's agenda as well.
Okay.
Was had a lot more discussion to it, but so that would be up to this committee to decide. If we feel it's going to be a lot more discussion, we could add it to a special session. If you feel like it could be discussed at next board meeting, then you can do to that. It's up to what you guys would like.
Okay, so with that, Janet, what do you think? Do you want a special session, or do you just want to table it till next month?
I will just withdraw my motion, and then you folks can figure it out from there.
Okay, so you know what? Why don't we just, to honor your time, let me just make sure I see what Superintendent Dixon says. We can place this on the Board Executive Committee for discussion. So let's just not take any action on this. And then if it comes back to us next month, we'll deal with it then. And it might be better not to have it with the special session because it might, mix the two. So we'll just leave it at that.
I'd hate to dilute the discussion on the turnarounds and have
yes, exactly.
Time in the next one.
Okay, so is there anything anyone else needs to say before we adjourn?
Goodbye.
Well, okay. And look, I just want to say this is Ruth, and she says goodbye. So thank you so much, committee. Thank you so much, staff, everybody. You guys are great. I'm going to savor these next 2 meetings I have until I'm done. So have a good Friday evening. See you guys.
Thanks. See you later.
Bye.